What's going on, everyone? This is Weezy from the What is Truth podcast. Hope everyone is doing rather exquisite. I've been looking extremely forward to this show for quite some time. I have author of several books, including his most recent book, The Official Myths, Exploding the Official Myths of the Lincoln Assassination, Mr. James Perloff. How are you, sir?
I'm doing good. Thank you very much, Wheezy, for having me on your show. First time I've been on this show.
Absolutely. So I have been going down this Lincoln assassination rabbit hole quite a bit. I What got me going was David McGowan's book on the subject,
Right.
and I've got tremendous respect for a lot of his work. He passed away back in
Mm-hmm.
2015, but um, just reading that book, I ended up doing a voiceover for that book, and so it's on my podcast player. And I've listened to that book probably 6, 7 times, maybe even more. And so that's what got me really invested. I started listening to lectures from people that were on the conspiratorial side as well as the official narrative side, like James
Mm-hmm.
Swanson. I read James Swanson's Manhunt. I saw the TV series as well. And so I've been fully invested in this. And it was through my constant research in finding lectures and books and whatnot that I ran into a show that you did, and that's when I decided to find you and contact you. I
Mm-hmm.
got your book. I read it. I finished it in just a couple of days. I, I've been going really hard in this, but for those that may not be familiar, that was a little bit long-winded, so I apologize for that. But for those that may not be too familiar, before we get started into this, what I expect to be nothing but a banger of a show, if you could give the folks a brief background of yourself and your work.
Well, thanks, Wheezy. Actually, I became awake, I guess you could call it, in 1978 when I read Gary Allen's book, None Dare Call It Conspiracy. And I began writing professionally about the deep state in 1986 when I started writing for the New American and published my first book in 1988 uh, called The Shadows of Power. Um, I've been going on since then. I've written a total of 8 books. I have my own independent website now, jamesperloff.net. And I can tell you that the official story of any major event is almost never the official story.
Yeah, I I agree with that. One of the things that I often say on my show is that I love history. I'm fully
Mm.
invested, and I just don't know how much of it I actually believe. I love the stories behind it, but when you really look at them, it's like you just try to parse out what's propaganda,
Mm-hmm.
uh, what actually really happened, and it's amazing how the 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 good guys have a batting average of 1,000 when it comes to history. They and that's where you get that history is always written by the victor.
Right.
That's the version you get most of the time. um, I'm Mexican American, and my parents
Mm-hmm.
were illegal immigrants from Mexico. I was born in California, but I knew about the Mexican U.S. Mexican War, and when I was in high school, the version that they try to teach me there, I was like, that's not what happened. And I didn't even believe in conspiracies back then, but I was like, that this is a bunch of hogwash. And they didn't even call it the US Mexican War when I was in high school. They called it the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So it was a whole whitewash of what the actual events that transpired. And so I already knew about James Polk. I already knew his rhetoric, what his campaign ran on. I knew all this stuff. um and so and that's from back then. And the more I get into a lot of these historical events, the more questions I have. What else have we been lied to? We still get lied to. We were lied to 200 years ago, and we're still being lied to constantly. And yeah, it's a fascinating track, and that's one of the reasons why I decided to name the show what it is. You know, what is truth? After going through everything.
Right. Well, I didn't realize you were Mexican American, and as such, you must be aware of the lies of the 1914 invasion of Mexico. Um,
Pancho Villa.
which was done. The invasion of Veracruz was done uh, publicly because Mexico wouldn't apologize by firing a 21 gun salute to the American flag for having arrested 8 of our naval officers after they illegally entered the Bay port of Tampico. They did so against um, official orders. They did so against the official curfew that was in effect, and they went into the area of Tampico that was off limits to foreigners. But President Woodrow Wilson said we would invade Mexico for this alleged violation of our national sovereignty. But if you read the works of uh, General Smedley Butler, who led the lead camp, lead regiment into Veracruz, um, the war had nothing to do with the failure to salute the American flag. It had to do with Standard Oil and the fact that the president of Mexico, Huerta, had refused to uh, uh, comply with his request for utter subservience by Woodrow Wilson. The real reason for the war was it was camp, regime change campaign. Um, Huerta was in favor of taxing Standard Oil, John D. Rockefeller's uh, company. He wanted to tax them for plundering oil out of Mexico. Standard Oil didn't want that, so they sent their representatives to Woodrow Wilson, who demanded regime change in Mexico. And as after we invaded Mexico, we backed a opponent of Huerta named Carranza, and Carranza is not the name topic of our conversation today, but Carranza was willing to give favor to Standard Oil in exchange for American dollars and weapons, and he overthrew Huerta, and that was the real story of the American invasion of Mexico in 1914, as related by General Smedley Butler, who I should mention was the most decorated Marine in U.S. history and the highest ranking Marine as a Major General in the history of the U.S. Marine Corps. He knew what was happening in Mexico. And this is just a simple example I often give to people of how the official story is not in accord with the real story.
Yeah, 100%. I actually have Smedley Butler's War is a Racket audiobook on my podcast player. So you're on Spotify, just search War is a Racket and um, it's just an hour long, but you know, the fact that he uh, he goes into detail of all the shenanigans that go on during war. He even admits to being a goon, you know, and his whole role in it. Uh, and actually last week we did a show on the Cold War, and I played the clip by General Ray C. Jordan, Major George Ray C. Jordan.
Oh, sure, sure.
Yeah, yeah, and where it's almost like he's doing a stand-up comedy or a comedy act. But he what he's talking about is so outlandish, and it's wild because, like you just said, it doesn't add up with the official tell of that we're always sold. When it comes to the Abraham Lincoln assassination, and I'm just speaking for myself, but I can't assume I'm the only one. But when you know, as a kid, you're growing up, all you really ever hear is a story that John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor, shoots Lincoln, jumps off the box, breaks his leg, and end of story. Lincoln is dead, and that's pretty much all you get told. And this is why I think I got fascinated, was because I didn't hear too many other people talking about it, and there's so much to the story. You have the Seward
Yeah.
attacks, and even the events. And I think this is going to be a great conversation, because I've come to my own thoughts in theories, and I'd love to discuss them. Uh, they may be things that you probably have never even thought about, but I'd love your opinion on some of
Sure.
these thoughts that have come up after devouring so much information over the last few months. But I think where we could start is, kind of going over the official narrative, if you wouldn't mind, for those that may not be too familiar, and then we could take it from there. And as you bring up some of the characters, I'll put up their faces on the screen so people can
Oh,
start associating names and faces, because that was one of the more overwhelming parts for me, at least, was how many names were there, and who was who, and trying to place this character where, and so I think by putting the images as we go over them, it'll make things a little easier. I hope
oh.
so, anyways.
Well, certainly it would, because the Lincoln assassination is not in fresh in many people's minds. We've had so much talk about the Kennedy assassination that the Lincoln assassination has taken a back burner. Um, so, to discuss the official narrative, on April the 9th, 1865, General Robert E. Lee, commander of the forces of Northern Virginia, surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. That was a famous event. And it basically marked the end of the Civil War, the war between the North and the South. Now, it's true that there were still a few Confederate forces um, who had not surrendered yet, but that was basically the end of the war, and it was celebrated in the North. And 5 days later, April the 14th, 1865, um, President Lincoln, with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, attended a comedy at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Now, during the third act, at approximately 10:15 p.m., John Wilkes Booth, a known Southern sympathizer and a very famous actor, Lincoln had actually seen him perform at Ford's Theater, entered the presidential box, shot Lincoln in the back of the head, and jumped onto the stage. Now, at that moment, it was kind of ironic. Booth's spur, he was planning to make his getaway on a horse, his spur caught on the American flag, and he dropped so awkwardly that he broke his leg. But that did not prevent him from rising up and yelling, "Sic semper tyrannis." That's always tyrannis to tyrants, which is the state motto of, or was the state motto of Virginia. And he also yelled, "The South is avenged." And he ran out the back door, jumped on a horse before anyone could catch him, and made his getaway. Now, in the meantime, and this is something that many people don't remember, um, a simultaneous assassination attempt was carried out against the Secretary of State, William Seward, who was bedridden from a recent carriage accident. Seward was in his bed, and he was attacked by one of Booth's accomplices, Lewis Powell, who stabbed him several times. And Seward was not expected to survive, but he did survive his wounds. Now, in the meantime, Booth and a riding companion named David Harold are riding south, but Booth's broken leg is really killing him. So they divert off course several miles to the west to a doctor who is known slightly by Booth, Dr. Samuel Mudd. Mudd took off Booth's boot, slightly reduced the fracture, and made a homemade cast, a crude homemade cast for Booth's fracture. Booth then continues to ride south with Harold, but very awkwardly at this point. The injury is really slowing him down. And then 12 days after the assassination, which is April the 26th, 1865, Booth is and his riding companion Harold are cornered in a Virginia barn by a detachment of U.S. cavalry, and Harold surrendered, but Booth refused to come out. And then, according to the official story, Booth was mortally wounded by a shot from one of the Union cavalrymen, Boston Corbett, who fired through a hole in the barn. And Booth died about 3 hours later. Um, Now, that basically wraps up the official story, except one thing, and this is official, that Booth originally had not intended to murder President Lincoln. He had intended to kidnap him. And on March the 17th, 1865, about a month before the assassination attempt, um, Booth and seven accomplices were waiting on a deserted uh, uh, strip of road, waiting for the presidential carriage to come by. And their plan was to kidnap Lincoln and to bring him south in the hopes that they could hold him hostage and uh, um, demand that in return for his release, thousands of Federal Southern POWs would be released, raising the hopes for the Confederacy, which was then in desperate straits. However, Lincoln canceled his travel plans for that reason, perhaps for the reason that he already knew about the kidnap attempt, and so the kidnap attempt never came off. Um, that is the basic story of the Lincoln assassination, but as we'll see, it has many, many holes in it.
Yeah, many holes is a understatement. So many holes, so many coincidences as well. And that's the thing with a lot of these stories, that I don't believe the official story at all.
Mm,
They're always riddled with crazy, wild coincidences and uh, wild strokes of luck, and they all just come together at one
right.
particular moment in time. You know, whether it's 9/11, finding
Mm,
the hijacker's passport nearby.
right.
Um, you know, just so many things in the Lincoln. There's so many funny things. You know, you have a story of Edwin Booth saving Robert Todd Lincoln's life from falling onto the train tracks.
Mm,
You have fiance of Wilkes Booth, Lucy Hale, who also is the daughter of Senator Hale, who's a hardcore abolitionist, and she's the fiance of John Wilkes Booth, who
right.
was anti-abolitionist. But anyways, he, they have a love triangle with Robert Todd Lincoln in the mix there, with Lucy Hale, and apparently, uh, uh, what's it? Lincoln dies on the same bed that Wilkes Booth once slept in. Just so many wild coincidences that just line up. And as we're gonna go through, you know, the official tale and trying to deconstruct it, um, and I want to make it clear too. You know, this is one of the things that I enjoyed about your book, is that you'll you know, you talk about, this is a part that's very controversial, here are the sides to it, and you lay it out very well. And so definitely, everyone, if you guys are getting interested in this conversation, definitely get Mr. James Perloff's book. It's an easy read, not complicated, you can follow along. And that was what I really appreciated about your book, sir, was how you laid down how you saw things, but you didn't say this is absolutely the way it happened 100%, you know, and there's no fudge room. And that's one of the things that kind of doesn't sit well with me with some of the, especially the mainstream official narrative historians. They'll talk about instances in the Lincoln assassination and they state them as a matter of fact. And it bothers me quite a bit. I listen to a gentleman that represents Ford's Theater, for example, and he was talking about all these events, and he was stating them as a matter of fact, no questioning. And I want to give some, before we go into much deeper, some of the, because I'm going to bring up some stuff that I don't think I've heard anyone else bring up, some of these points that I've thought, mulled over in my head. And some people may say, well, that's just speculation. Well, the problem is this official tell is full of speculation. Uh, let's just talk about Wilkes Booth jumping from that 11-foot landing and allegedly breaking his leg there. Most people will go with that, but other people will say he broke his leg later on when the horse rolled over his leg. And you have Dr. Mudd saying that the injury wasn't very serious at all. So now you have three versions. Which one do you go with? Do you go with the consensus? Do you go with the one that makes more sense? Um, and that's just one small example. And there's many of these instances throughout the Lincoln assassination tell that there is no clear consensus. There's varying degrees even amongst the people that follow the official narrative. So um yeah, that was just one thing I wanted to get out there. um any thoughts on that, Mr. Perloff?
Yeah, I think that John Wilkes Booth did break his leg, and this is what changed the narrative from Booth being allowed to escape to Booth being assassinated at the Garrett Farm in Virginia. It was something that neither he nor the main architect of the conspiracy, which was Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War, could not have anticipated. Um, I want to talk a little about some of the anomalies that occurred on the day of the assassination. And one of the is that General Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, was supposed to attend the play, Our American Cousin, with President Lincoln and his wife on the night that the assassination took place. Um, General Grant canceled out very late, and he gave as his official reason that he wanted to visit his family in New Jersey. Now, this didn't really make sense because there was nothing urgent about visiting the family in New Jersey. There was no wedding about to take place. There was nobody who had died recently. He was going to have a funeral. But Grant canceled out, and he did not learn of Lincoln's assassination until he was on the train for New Jersey that night. Um, what was the real reason that he canceled out? Now, you're going to find something which I find amusing, which is that mainstream historians have a prearranged take on every aspect of the Lincoln assassination. And so for Grant canceling out, they say that the reason he did this was that his wife, Julia, did not get along well with Mary Todd Lincoln. And granted, Mary Todd Lincoln was a high tempered woman. However, all the Grants have been asked to do is to sit in full public view in Ford's Theater with the Lincolns. This is not going to result in a catfight between the two women. It doesn't make sense. The real reason that General Grant did not go to Ford's Theater that night is with his Department of War visit that occurred that day, and the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, told Grant that he should not go to Ford's Theater that night because could be extremely dangerous. And for this reason, Grant canceled his appointment to visit Lincoln and attend Ford's Theater. Now, I want to compare that to the advice that Edwin Stanton gave to President Lincoln. President Lincoln's his daytime bodyguard, was named William Crook. And
William
here's
Crook,
what
yep.
William Crook wrote in his memoirs, quote, I was surprised when late on the afternoon of the 14th, that's the day of the assassination. I accompanied Mr. Lincoln on a hurried visit to the War Department. I found that the president was more depressed than I'd ever seen him, and his step was unusually slow. Mr. Lincoln said to me, "Crick, do you know that there are men who want to take my life?" Then, after a pause, he said, "I know that there are believe I believe there are men who want to take my life." Then, after a pause, he said, "And I have no doubt that they will do it." The conviction with which he spoke dismayed me. I wanted to protest, but his tone had been so calm and so sure that I found myself saying instead, "Why do you think so, Mr. President?" "Other men have been assassinated," was his reply. All I could say was, "I hope you're mistaken, Mr. President." End quote. William F. Crook, Lincoln's daytime bodyguard. Now, um, Lincoln, Crook stood outside, went into the War Department, and he saw the head of the War Department, William Stanton. I'm sorry, Edwin Stanton, who we will thoroughly vet during this interview. Stanton told Lincoln he should not go to Ford's Theater, but not with the same urgent conviction that had given to Grant. And Lincoln said, "I'm planning to go to Ford's Theater. I want a reliable bodyguard." And he requested that Stanton's assistant, um, Thomas Eckert, who ran the telegraph office, the cipher desk, be his bodyguard. Lincoln had seen Eckert break iron, thank you for putting that up, iron pokers over his arm. He knew he was extremely uh, um, strong. Stanton said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Lincoln, I can't spare Major Stanton tonight. He is going to be busy in the War Department." We know this from Edward Bates, the assistant to Major Eckert, who wrote it about it in his memoirs many years later. Now, Eckert said to Lincoln, who Lincoln went to directly to his desk and asked him to be his bodyguard. Eckert said, "I'm sorry, Mr. President, I can't be your bodyguard tonight because I am so tied up with work tonight." Now, Lincoln said to Eckert, "Surely, Major, your work could wait till the morning?" And Eckert said, "No, it's got to be done tonight." Now, the thing to know about this is very painful to recount, but Eckert and Stanton were not in the War Department that night. Um, Eckert had no urgent duties in the War Department. He signed off his desk to his assistant, Edward Bates, and Edwin Stanton, not knowing that to later be discredited by memoirs written years later, claimed that he truthfully that he went home, had dinner at home, and did not hear about the Lincoln assassination until he was at home. So neither Stanton nor Eckert are even in the War Department that night. They were not. They were lying to Lincoln, and the mainstream historians have a spin on everything, and they say that the reason that Stanton and Eckert lied to Lincoln is they thought if they denied him the protection he wanted at Ford's Theater, which was assassinated, that he would change his mind and not go to Ford's Theater. But Lincoln said right then and there, he was still going to Ford's Theater. He said, I'm sorry, Major Eckert, I want you as my bodyguard, but I will take Major Henry Rathbone instead." This was a last minute substitute. Major Henry Rathbone was in the presidential box when Lincoln was assassinated. He was there with his fiancee, Clara Harris, who was daughter of a former U.S. Senator, Ira Harris. And when Lincoln was assassinated, uh, Major Eckert leapt to his feet, and Major Rathbone, raised to his feet and grappled with John Wilkes Booth, but he was stabbed deeply by um, John Wilkes Booth so deeply with a Bowie knife that it broke an artery. Then Booth leapt onto the stage, leaving Lincoln and Rathbone behind. And I should talk about who was assigned to uh, Abraham Lincoln as his bodyguard that night. But I feel I've been talking for too long, so let me throw it back to you in case you have any comments to make. I'm sorry, do you want me to go on?
I'm sorry, I was muted and I was talking.
Okay.
I forgot to unmute myself. So I think you're gonna go into John F. Parker next, which is that's that's a huge part of the story. But I have many questions, even with the occupants that were in the box that night, which were, depending on the sources, most sources will say that the four occupants in the box were Major Henry Rathbone, his stepsister, fiance Clara Harris,
Mhm.
Mary Todd Lincoln, and Abraham Lincoln. And apparently, Mr. Forbes, uh, many decades after the fact, said that he was also present there later on. But let's just go with the four occupants in the box. I've been this. This is a part that really gets to me, is that Henry Rathbone, we really only have the, during the depositions, only Henry Rathbone ever gave a deposition. Clara Harris did not give one, and neither did Mary Todd Lincoln.
True.
And the problem, a huge problem that I have with Henry Rathbone's deposition is that his first deposition was written in the third person. His second deposition was verbatim exactly the same, but the only difference was from the third person to the first person.
Mhm.
And then again, when he gave the statement again during John Surratt's Jr.'s trial, a few years later,
Mhm.
3 years later, word for word, the exact same script, which leads one to believe, why was he giving this deposition word for word? Who does this? When people are recounting, and if you, I feel if you are really there, you are going to maybe have a couple variances, that maybe a couple things that you missed the first time around,
Right.
but it's hugely strange that this man, who would later be charged with a self-inflicted knife wound and kill his stepsister wife later on, this guy is repeating the things. I have many questions about what happened in that booth. I have never been to Ford's Theater. I want to go there for the 160th anniversary next year. I hope to be there that weekend and be there in person. After digging in through so many of these books, to actually be there and experience it, I think it's going to give it a different feel for sure. But based on some of the videos I've seen online of Ford's Theater and the booth, it doesn't look like a very large room. And we are told that John Wilkes Booth gets into that box and apparently no one notices. And he grabs a stick, or a piece of plank that's perfectly fitted, does all this, wedges the door, and no one still has no idea. And it's a small little space. This is what I'm trying to wrap my head until I go there in person and I actually see it. I'll be able to ease a lot of these questions that I have in my head. But I'm like, it just seems very strange that all these things, these happenings are happening, and no one in there noticed him coming in, wedging that door shut. And Henry Rathbone says in his deposition, I should have it memorized by now because again, he repeats the same thing over and over. But he and here's another funny thing. We are told John Wilkes Booth had his knife in the left hand, gun with the right hand, a one shot Derringer, and I hope we get into that because that's another key to the story.
Very key. Yeah.
Yeah, and he comes in, shoots Lincoln through the left ear, and it lodges behind his right eyeball, and similar to the Trump assassination attempt. But in this case, Lincoln turns his head at the wrong time, and that's what get him killed. Trump apparently turns his head at the right time and survives. So many interesting things there. But anyways, we're told he does that, and because it's such an awkward scene, for a right-hander with a gun to make that shot, that's why they said that he had to turn his head. And according to Rathbone's account, after he shot him, Wilkes Booth yells, "Freedom!" It's almost like and I'm sorry to laugh, but it's the more I've replayed this official tale happening, it seems comical almost in a sense. It's unfortunate the president had to die, but I'm just the way the story it's like a cartoon. A guy with a knife on the left hand and a one shot Derringer on the right hand, wearing his getaway suit, for lack of a better term, as Don Thomas puts out. Does this and then jumps onto the stage. I mean, so many of these things just don't add up. So after hearing that little diatribe, have you ever, Mr. Perloff, even considered Henry Rathbone as a potential suspect?
I don't think he was. I think he was invited as a last minute substitute for General Grant, who had canceled out. And as you probably know, Major Rathbone died in an insane asylum after attempting to kill his wife and children. In
And enough
Germany.
self-inflicted knife wound,
Right.
which you try to say happened through an attacker.
I think that is sort of PTSD from his regret of not having saved Lincoln rather than his being an accomplice. He was badly stabbed by John Wilkes Booth so deeply that it broke an artery, and most of the blood found in the presidential box at Fort State was not from President Lincoln, as most people assumed. It was from Major Henry Rathbone. I don't think he was an accomplice, but his story makes very interesting reading, as does that of his fiancee, Clara Harris, in which she witnessed. He was the first to report that a special block had been formed to be put between the wall and the door of the outer entrance to the presidential box. This required very careful carpentry work, which Booth would not have been capable of, and also a peephole had been carved into the presidential box so that Booth could observe his victim before he shot him. Now, this raises the main question of why was it that Booth was so confident he only needed a one-shot pistol to dispose of the President of the United States. You'd think he would have brought multiple bullets, but he only brought a one-shot Derringer plus his knife, and this makes no sense unless he has inside knowledge that the president is going to be deserted by his bodyguard shortly before the assassination, which is probably the next thing we should get into.
Yeah, I just find like I try to lay down anyways. That's why I kind of view him in a suspicious role, because it's not natural to repeat word for word your statements. Like it's clearly a memorized script that he was going off all three times, and then not to not have any really much of public words from Mary Todd Lincoln. Here's another interesting thing that just goes through my mind. So we're told through Henry Rathbone's own words, because no one else saw these skirmishes. The only people that saw the skirmish were Clara Harris, um, Mary Todd Lincoln, and of course Henry Rathbone. But the only statements we have from the actual slashing and shooting, are from only Henry Rathbone. And Henry Rathbone states that uh, during the whole attack, Miss Harris and Miss Todd Lincoln were both seated the entire time. It wasn't until John Wilkes Booth ran off the stage, gave his Sic Semper Tyrannis, and ran off the stage that Miss Todd Lincoln um, got, screamed. Wait, it's such a weird scene for me. And I guess we can, this kind of segues into John F. Parker in a sense. And it segues in that Mary Todd Lincoln specifically asked for John F. Parker. Mr. Otto Eisenschimmel shows the letter. It's in White House letterhead where Mary Todd Lincoln is specifically asking for John F. Parker, which is a weird anomaly because Mr. John F. Parker, Officer John F. Parker, was one of the most demerited cops in the force. He had behavior unbecoming of a police officer, used insolent language. I mean, he was just a scumbag. And Mary Todd Lincoln specifically, out of all the people, she requested. This is why the occupants inside the booth and Henry Rathbone. So maybe you might disagree with me, but this is why I view suspicion throughout all these events. And I hope that makes sense. Maybe I'm just rambling a bit, but maybe you could see where I'm coming from, from this angle.
All right. Well, John F. Parker was a really bad person to select as a bodyguard. As you mentioned, many complaints were brought against him as a member of the Washington Metropolitan Police, and this included not only the foul language, but visiting a brothel, being drunk on duty, and being asleep on duty. And yet, before Lincoln was assassinated, he deserted his post. He went next door to what was called the Star Saloon and began to booze it up. And he was not at his post when Lincoln was assassinated. And I just want to quote what William Crook, the daytime bodyguard of President Lincoln, said about Crook. He said Crook should have been at the president's box, quote, fully armed, and to permit no unauthorized person to pass. Incredible as it may seem, he quietly deserted his post of duty. Yet through this guard's amazing recklessness, to use no stronger words, that Booth accomplished his foul deeds, and quote, William Crook. So you would think that John F. Parker, the bodyguard at Ford's Theater, for deserting his post and allowing the president to be assassinated, would have lost his job at the very least, and at the most would have been imprisoned. But he was not imprisoned, nor did he lose his job. In fact, he remained, this is crazy, after allowing the president of the United States to be assassinated through negligence, he was allowed to remain on the presidential bodyguard detail. When Mary Todd Lincoln saw him on the at the White House, still in this capacity, she screamed that he was responsible for her husband's death. And even granting that Mary Todd Lincoln was a high-strung woman, you can't deny that she was correct in this respect. John F. Parker deserted his post. He let the president be assassinated, and there was no punishment forthcoming. Now, you would think that he would have lost his job, and in fact, the Washington Metropolitan Police instigated a investigation of John F. Parker for his desertion of duty, but the charges were all dropped, and the record of those charges being dropped has all disappeared from the official records. I should mention that to have the charges dropped against him required clout from someone with tremendous influence, and uh, that man of influence, of course, would have been the man who took charge of the Lincoln assassination investigation, the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton.
Yeah, I agree. Edwin Stanton, I've come to associate as a 1800s version of a Dick Cheney.
Good
Just an evil
comparison.
character, uh, calling a lot of the shots. Um, you know, one of the major things that he did not do was, when the manhunt began to look for the escapee John Wilkes Booth, uh, closed down every other area north, east, except of course the Navy Yard Bridge, the most likely of places to escape. The other interesting thing, and there are many interesting things, one of those that doesn't get talked about a lot is how several newspapers, many miles away, reported Lincoln dead while he was still alive, which to me is an indicator that there were people in the know that was going to happen that day. And so some newspapers kind of got a little head start in that department. Did any of your research take you there when investigating this?
Well, one of the things that's very important is that all around Washington, the telegraph wires went out of service immediately after Lincoln's
For about
assassination.
4 hours, 3 4 hours or so. So that gave them a head start.
Right.
Uh,
That gave John Wilkes Booth and his accomplices at least a 2 hour head start um, on their escape from Washington. This was very significant. And what's important to remember is that the man in charge of those telegraph wires was the same man who
Thomas
refused
Eckert.
to be Lincoln's bodyguard that night, Major Thomas Eckert, who was in charge of the telegraph desk. He'd refused to be Lincoln's bodyguard. Um, Untruthfully, the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, had said, "We need Major Eckert to handle the telegraph wires tonight." But Major Eckert was not anywhere near the telegraph wires that night. And I actually want to quote to you, this is pretty rare, Major Eckert's testimony before the, thanks, thank you for that picture. Um, Eckert was testifying before Congress in 1867. Here's the exchange that took place. Quote, "Do you have knowledge of the telegraph wires in or about the times of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln?" "I did." "Was there any interruption of the lines that night?" "Yes, sir." "What was it?" Quote, "It was my impression at the time that they were cut, but we got circuit very early the next morning. The manager of the commercial office reported that the cause was crossing of the wires and the main batteries. Throwing a ground wire over the wires, um, the main wires, would have caused the same trouble, and taking it off would have put them into ordinary working condition. Was there an investigation into what was the real cause of the difficulty?" "No, sir. I did not. It did not seem at the time to be sufficiently important, as the interruption only lasted for about 2 hours." End quote. Congress and Major Eckert. Now, I'd like to point out a couple of things here. Uh, Eckert says he didn't investigate this because it only lasted for 2 hours. Well, how does he know it's only going to last for 2 hours? He was in charge of the telegraph desk. This was his job. How does he know it's only going to last 2 hours? How does he know it won't last for 6 or 8 hours? It doesn't really make sense. He also describes how the telegraph wires could have been shut off. Uh, He himself said it could have been done by throwing a ground wire over the main wires. John Wilkes Booth did not have that expertise. Major Eckert did. I also want to say this about Major Eckert, about his loyalty to Secretary of State. I'm sorry, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Major Eckert was subsequently made the Assistant Secretary of War, and after he left the government, he had a meteoric rise in the telegraph industry, culminating with his becoming president and chairman of Western Union. Now, Western Union, you must understand that Western Union was in charge of the most advanced telecommunications system in America at that time. Nothing was more advanced than the telegraph wire. There were no telephones yet. Of course, email was decades away, but the closest thing you had to email was the telegraph wires, by which you could send a message from Boston to St. Louis, and within minutes, your message would be read. He became in charge of all of that. He became Stanton's assistant secretary of war. He had refused to become Lincoln's bodyguard on the day of the assassination, and yet he's in charge of this telegraph system, which he says he did not have time. He says, I was too busy to monitor the telegraph wires. That is the exact same excuse he gave to Lincoln on the day of the assassination. He said, I'm sorry, Mr. Lincoln, I can't be your bodyguard tonight because I'll be too busy. And this parallel was pointed out by the amazing Otto Eisenschimmel in his book 1937, Why Was Lincoln Murdered? He was the first person to officially break the official narrative of the Lincoln assassination.
1937,
Mm.
just a great book. Yeah, and more evidence to show how close the relationship between Edwin Stanton and Mr. Eckert goes in the fact that Thomas Eckert was the personal body guard, for Lewis Powell later on. This is a guy that's, has these high important duties, and then he's relegated to watch over Lewis Powell. And I have many questions about the Seward attacks coming up as well. But yeah, the whole thing with a lot of these players, Edwin Stanton, if you listen to the official narrative, people, a lot of them will get angry. They say Edwin Stanton loved Lincoln. He was, yeah, they were bitter at first, but they resolved their issues, and Stanton became a loyal friend of Lincoln. And when it comes to Lincoln, it's kind of like the Kennedy assassination. A lot of people will view Kennedy as a saint, but he had some demons, he had some skeletons in his closet. Abraham Lincoln gets portrayed today, which is very interesting. Even at the time, there were people that called him a Christ-like figure because he had been assassinated on a Good Friday, things along those lines. And now, the vast consensus of people, probably people that don't know much about history, they're just little tidbits here and there. Vast majority of folks view Lincoln as a angel, as a great hero, but people don't realize that even in Lincoln's time when he was running, he wasn't the most liked individual, even within his own party and ranks. And he did do some good things, but he also, like many others, had many skeletons. I'm trying to think some off the top of my head. For example, the Dakota 38 goes under his name. Even the Andersonville debacle, which doesn't really get linked up to Lincoln, but those were prisoner swaps that were denied because the Union had way more expendable men that they didn't worry about the captured ones. Forget about them. That's another black mark. But and the reason I'm bringing this up is people are going to ask, well, why? What is the motive? Why would they want to get rid of Lincoln? Because okay, you just stated some bad stuff on Lincoln. What was the reason? And I feel Don Thomas did a real good job in his book. Well, and
Absolutely.
on yeah, laying down the reason. What are your thoughts as to why the powers that be wanted Lincoln removed?
Okay. During his term in office, and this has been brought up by very effectively by Thomas De Lorenzo. Lincoln did proceed as a tyrant. He shut down more than 300 newspapers that opposed him. He put state legislators that opposed the policy into jail. However, the outcome of the war was quite different. In the outcome of the war, the radical Republicans, the most extreme members of Lincoln's cabinet, wanted to subjugate the South, which is what really happened. They wanted to deny Southerners the right to vote for their own governors, and in fact, the South was placed under martial law under military dictators for 12 years following the Civil War, and 2 billion um, bales of cotton were confiscated. They wanted to exploit the South, which had already been destroyed economically, but nonetheless, they wanted to steal its property, its businesses. And if you remember if you ever seen the movie Gone with the Wind, um, uh, Scarlett O'Hara goes to uh, Rhett Butler, and she begs him to save her property at Terra from Yankee taxes. And Brett says, "I'm sorry, but I'm in prison with the Yankees. I can't help you at this time." Um, but this was really happening at that time. Properties were taken over, but Lincoln opposed this. Lincoln wanted properties restored to their rightful owners, and most importantly, he wanted the southern states to be restored to the Union, to Congress, and the radical Republicans realized that this happened, that the Southern Democrats would unite with the Northern Democrats and put them out of power. It was the radical Republicans who were representing the deep state at that time. So Lincoln stood in the way of uh, Reconstruction, economic exploitation of the South that took place after the war. He had to be removed. Now, they still needed him to win re-election in November of 1864 to keep the Republicans in Congress, but after November of 1864, he was totally expendable. Now, I didn't mention this in my book, but if you go back to a famous movie made in 1915, Birth of Republic, um, directed by uh, J. Edward Griffith, who also directed The Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston many years later. A very famous movie at the time in 1915. It portrays Lincoln's death in the following manner. He is mourned in the South, which is true, his death, but the radical Republican in the movie, who was called Stoneman, he was actually a representative of Thaddeus Stevens, who was a legislator from Pennsylvania, and the movie identifies him as a legislator from Pennsylvania, so you know that's who the movie's talking about. When he hears of Lincoln's death, he replies with a sly smile. Now, this movie was made 22 years before Eisenschimmel. They weren't getting it from Eisenschimmel. The truth is that the Lincoln's death was mourned by the South. Um, uh, I have a number of quotations in my book. You know, um, back in the 1990s, when I was studying the Civil War, I read a book 440 pages long called A Confederate Girl's Diary by Sarah Morgan Darson. And the last words in her book was, quote, Our Confederacy is gone with one crash. The report of the pistol fired at Lincoln. Everybody in the South knew this. Jefferson Davis condemned the shooting of Lincoln, so did Robert E. Lee, so did the newspapers in Virginia. They all realized what it meant. It meant the death of Lincoln was going to mean the end of a what Lincoln had called for in his 1864 inaugural address, which was charity for all, malice towards none. He did not want a brutal Reconstruction imposed on the South. Getting rid of Lincoln imposed that Reconstruction. That's why he was taken out. It was not an act of vengeance by the South.
Well said. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. So I suppose, and did you need a break uh, now, Mr. Perloff, or
No, we can keep going. Yeah, that's fine.
okay? So I want to get into the next part of this, which rarely gets talked about, and it is the Seward attack. Um, you know, just in a nutshell, we're told that. Let me put his little. He was a handsome young man,
Right.
big
How?
strapping guy. Let's see here. Where is he? Okay, there he is on the screen. There was a colored one that I wanted to put because it looks more contemporary. Uh, there's a strapping young Lewis Powell, Lewis Payne, uh, the Reverend or Mosby. He had so many aliases. So, for the sakes of all this, I'll just keep with Lewis Powell. But Lewis Powell was a Southern boy. Uh,
Right.
lived in Florida. Lived in Georgia. Uh, apparently, at his young age of 19 or 20 years old, he was already a veteran of the war, is what we're
Mm-hmm.
told. And uh, when you see the pictures of the hanged individuals along with Mary Surratt, he clearly stands out because he's the biggest of the bunch, big old dude. Now, I want to get into this attack, and we may see things a little different in this one. And I think it'll be a fun conversation because um, it exposes people to a different set of ideas than the normal, typical storyline that people get fed constantly. But if if you want, Mr. Perlov, if you can just summarize the attack on the Seward home, super quick, so that we can break it down, if you don't mind, because I have many questions regarding that official tell as well.
Hmm. Okay. I don't know if I can answer them all, but I will say to repeat what we said earlier. Um, Lewis Powell attacked the Secretary of State William Seward in his home. Seward was bedridden from a very serious carriage accident, which not all people believe was an accident, and he stabbed Seward in his bed several times. Seward was not expected to survive the wounds, but he did. Now, there's no question he was an accomplice of Booth, and this was a genuine assassination attempt. Um, but there's some strange things about this. How did Powell gain entrance to the Seward home? Well, he pretended to be a pharmacy delivery boy. He said to the servant, "I've come from the pharmacy with a prescription from Dr. Verdi." Dr. Verdi was, in fact, Seward's physician. The servant was suspicious, said, I'll take it to him. But Powell said, no, no, I need to give this to him myself. And Powell knew exactly where the stairs were. He knew exactly where Seward's bedroom was on the third floor of the house. And this goes back to um, John Wilkes Booth. He knew that the bodyguard was not going to be there. That's why he knew he only needed one bullet to take care of Lincoln. There was definitely inside information being passed from high authorities to Booth and to his accomplice, Lewis Powell. Um, that's probably um, the most I should say. But you said you got some questions about the assassination attempt on Secretary of State Seward. But there's one thing I should mention, which is very important. Um, there were only two prominent people in Lincoln's administration who opposed the exploitation of the South through Reconstruction. Those were President Lincoln himself and Secretary of State Seward, who also wanted a amicable um, reconciliation with the South. Why is it that John Wilkes Booth, alleged Southern sympathizer, attacks the only two people who want a gentle making of peace with the South and avoids attacking the people who want to brutally exploit the South following the war? This is the question that mainstream historians will not ask.
Yeah, good points. Um, so the deeper I've dug into this, I questioned. I well, let me preface what I'm about to say because some people are going to dismiss me entirely if I don't give a caveat. There are many things we have been told and have been declared as historical fact. Man landing on the moon is one of those.
Hmm, right.
Weapons of mass destruction in Iraq are
Oh,
another
you got
one.
that right. Yeah.
There are many of these events that are passed away as historical fact, which we now know are complete nonsense. And so that's my caveat to what I want to preface what I'm about to say. I highly doubt there was any attack at the Seward home, and the reasons being are many. There were only 3 depositions. There were many occupants allegedly, um, in the home during this attack. Many abled men, many armed men, more than Lewis Powell and his broken gun, for sure. And so when I when you look at even the depositions of the 3 that gave their depositions, the 3 were Houseboy Bell, who
Mm,
answered the door.
mm,
The other one came from the nurse Robinson,
right.
who allegedly grappled with Lewis Powell. And then we have Augustus Seward, who wasn't even mentioned by anyone until he gave his own account, in which he states that he was sleeping. He went to bed. He retired to bed at 7 p.m. and he was due to wake up at 11, to sit in with father. But in the initial reports, he wasn't even mentioned. And so, why did we never get any depositions from Mr. William Seward himself?
Mm,
What about Frederick Seward? What about Fanny Seward?
mm,
Emmerich Hansel? I mean, it's to me, this is where um, a lot of the doubt comes in, because now you only have 3 of the folks that were allegedly there, and when you compare notes to all 3 of them, they don't add up.
mm,
So you have Robinson saying that he never heard Lewis Powell say a thing. Then you had Augustus Seward saying he heard him, he heard Lewis Powell in his rage say, "I am mad, I am mad." And then
mm,
you have Houseboy Bell, who he's and that's the other interesting thing, that out of all the folks in the home, those were the 3 that gave depositions, and 2 of those 3 were black. And that's
mm,
important because we're dealing with 1865
mm,
um, America. So that's a huge part where black folks didn't, their opinions and thoughts weren't really valued. It was a different time, if you will. But 2 of those 3 that gave depositions were black, like I just stated. And Houseboy Bell is the one that kind of in his deposition he says that uh he doesn't want to let Powell in, but Powell forces his way in. He's got to give the medicine to Seward himself,
Mm,
uh, and after he claims he saw Powell then strike Frederick Seward. Frederick Seward falls, and that's when Houseboy Bell decides to run out the house yelling "murder, murder,"
mm.
um, and that's
But
his. He didn't see anything else. Okay, then you go into um, Robinson's deposition, and he claims that he's when he was wrestling with Powell, a mystery man comes in. He never. It wouldn't have been one of the Sewards because he knew the Seward family. He just says a man comes in. He doesn't name the person that comes in and helps him, you know, get Powell out of the room. And he soon describes this assailant as having whiskers and a mustache. A few days later, he changes the story and saying, no, 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 it was definitely Lewis Powell, the picture of Lewis Powell. But he changed the story. This is my own little gathering from and I hope you're staying with me because
sure.
um so Edwin Stanton's first releases on the Seward attack claim that John Surratt Jr. was the attacker on the home. Okay. The deposition of Robinson and where he describes a man with whiskers and a mustache describes a John Surratt Jr. And I feel because when they find out that John Surratt Jr. was nowhere near the area, he was in New York, they had to
Right.
change the story to mold it into what they wanted.
Mm,
Okay. And so when you look at then Augustus Seward's account of the events, he first confuses his dad for the Black Robinson, and then he confuses uh, um, uh, Powell for the nurse. How the hell, you've got an older white gentleman in the room, you've got a black gentleman, and you have a young athletic white gentleman. How does Augustus Seward get everyone mixed up in this? And in none of their accounts is Frederick Seward ever really brought up, except under Bell's. And James Swanson in his book Manhunt talks that Frederick Seward got his head bashed in so hard that brain matter came out and the steel ramrod broke on the gun. These to me are just elaborate exaggerations and based on the depositions all contradicting each other, none of it making any sense at all. I have serious doubts as to the Seward attack. And it's also convenient that Seward suffered this horse carriage accident where his jaw is wired shut, and that's what protected him and saved his life, which doesn't make sense at all if it's Lewis Powell, a Southern boy. He's a Southern boy that has obviously killed animals. If he's a good old country boy, he knows how to gut and skin animals. I mean that, if you live in the South, that's the way of life. You're going to tell me that this young man that beats the crap out of everyone in a Rambo style manner can't find a way to kill a man that is basically comatose laying in bed? I find it incredibly hard to believe. And the other thing, let's go back to this image. Here is Lewis Powell, arrested shortly after. Not a single scratch. Nothing on his hands,
right.
nothing on his neck, nothing on his face. And so I know it sounds out of left field, but I tried to lay down my case as well as possible, Mr. Perloff. And I hope you were able to follow me along. But do you see why I have questions regarding this whole issue?
Well, I think those are very reasonable questions, and certainly it's true that Lewis Powell was a rugged Confederate veteran. He fought at Fredericksburg. Um, in Gettysburg and other battles. He was a wounded veteran. He certainly, nobody in his command doubted his courage, and certainly he was capable of killing the Secretary of State. I think it is possible that, given that he was restrained by Robinson and members of the Seward family, um, that this and the fact that Seward had a sort of an iron cage protecting his face during due to the carriage accident, that the wounds inflicted by Powell might have they did think he was going to die from the wounds, but he didn't. I think that uh, Powell was carrying out a genuine assassination attempt, but did fail in that regard due to the facial metal restraints and the restraint from the nurse and from the members of the Seward family. I think that that's credible. Um, I do believe he's trying to carry out a genuine assassination attempt.
Okay. Yeah, and fair enough. Like I said, I knew we would probably not see eye to eye
Sure,
on it, and I'm sure my view is very very fringe. I'm sure if you have gone, anyone, any listeners gone down the whole Lincoln rabbit hole, probably just heard me say what I had to say and like, whoa, this guy's way off. But I tried to lay down my case why I
sure.
have many questions.
That's
The
very
other
reasonable. Very reasonable. Yeah.
Well, and it's also interesting that Davy Harold rode along with him, and then apparently got frightened and then rode off. And 8 miles later, somehow without GPS, without cell phone electronics, he caught up with Booth, which is
Mm,
another funny, interesting bit of it. But Powell apparently, being a Southern boy, wasn't familiar with the area. Uh, Pretty much everyone was from the Maryland area, except Powell. He was the only true Southern boy,
mm,
and so he apparently made his way to the only place that he really knew, and that was Mary Surratt's home,
mm. Right.
where
Mm,
everyone else was carrying along. And see, there's so many parts that just, it's like crazy coincidences. I mean, the Lewis Powell we get told about is this ruthless young man, just an assassin, a straight murderer, and yet he can't kill a guy laying in bed, that's just laying there comatose. And then his other bonehead mistake, he walks up, to Mary Surratt's home while they're being questioned by the cops.
mm,
They're being investigated, and he's all dirty. Apparently, he's got his blood-stained coat still on and whatnot. And he knocks on the door, and one of the detectives, because they're interrogating Mary, answers the door. I'm like, "What do you want?" He goes, uh, I think he gives the answer. I'm looking for Mary. I'm. He goes, What are you doing out here this late? And I was digging some ditches out. I'm
mm.
gonna be digging some ditches, and
Right.
I mean, like this time of day. And then they ask Mary, "Do you know this guy?" And she kind of freaks out, gets nervous. No, I never seen him in my life. And that's what got all of them arrested that night. And
Mm.
so to me, it's like, okay, this guy should have known something was going on at the Surrett home. Like what? He's just gonna walk in, just casually, and just a bonehead mistake. So many. I don't know. Maybe I'm just thinking too much about these things, but so many of these
No.
things just don't add up. And I've thought them through. Does this part make reasonable sense?
Mm.
This part does. This seems like it just so happily happened. There's so many parts to it that's why I I have these questions in my head.
Those are great questions, and I should mention that well, Booth and his writing companion David Harold rode very strong horses out of Washington, and we should probably touch on how they were able to get across the bridge out of Washington. But Lewis Powell was given a very strange horse. he was given a one-eyed carriage horse that could not ride fast. And it appears that this horse that Powell was trying to, William Bell, the servant at the Seward home, was chasing Powell on this horse, and the horse was so slow that Bell was able to keep up with it for a long distance, and he called for help from federal soldiers who gave him no assistance. It seems that the horse eventually threw Powell, but it's interesting that Powell was not given a good horse to escape from Washington. He had no means of escape, and I didn't go into this in my book, but there's a very strange story concerning Powell, which is that after the assassination attempts, he was given a fresh coat and fresh boots by Louis Weichmann, who was a federal spy operating in the Seward boarding house. And when he gave him this new outfit, including a pass to get out of Washington for one day, he was accompanied by a federal police officer. And the question is, why would a federal police officer permit the attempted assassin of the Secretary of State? Why would he give him a pass to get out of Washington? These are questions that are not answered. And because they're not answered and I don't know the answer, I don't get into it in my book, but these are truths. And it's also true that it's an amazing coincidence that Powell was arrested at the very time that detectives had arrived at Mary Surratt's boarding house and were arresting her. And at that very moment, Powell shows up, apparently starving, and they question him, and he says, "Well, I've been hired to dig a ditch, a drainage ditch for Mrs. Surratt," and Miss Surratt didn't recognize him. Well, Miss Surratt actually did have very poor vision. This is confirmed by many people. She only saw him in the darkness of the room, but this was used to establish by the prosecution to establish that Mary Surratt had a connection with the attempted assassin, Secretary of State Lewis Powell.
Yeah, and you reminded me. Louis Weichmann is a interesting character. He was
Definitely.
more than likely a what do you call it? Someone that infiltrated John Wilkes Booth's ragtag band of conspirators.
Mm,
Um, I view him as a scumbag, a snitch,
mm,
and this guy. So everyone gets hung and gets all the meets some terrible ends, but this guy, no, nothing happens to him. Yeah. Some may even view him as somewhat of a hero, unsung hero in all this. The more I've learned about this guy, I just yeah, he's a complete scummy character. That worked. Um, you know, was it uh, Lafayette Baker, right?
mm,
Um, and reported all these findings. They reported over to Edwin Stanton. So, and this is key because the conspirators were given this trial, if you want to call it that. They were all civilians, and they were all made to go through a military tribunal
mm,
where the judges were all handpicked. Um, they this it didn't matter how good of a lawyer you were, a defense lawyer. There was nothing you were going to do to get your people out of this. And the biggest issue is that a lot of people um will realize and understand that Booth didn't make his decision to kill Lincoln until that day, that very day.
mm. Correct.
And so we know that. So why were these other people hung? It's because of how ridiculous, you know, a trial they were given. They were made to wear these heavy leather masks, hoods over them. They couldn't talk to anyone. And like I mentioned previously, Thomas Eckert personally watched over Lewis Powell.
Correct. Yeah.
It's it was really, really a sham, and I think it was all done, to dole out justice right away. Justice has been served. The people behind Lincoln's murder have all been captured and rounded about. Similar to 9/11, that very day, we know, we were told that Osama bin Laden was behind this right
Right.
there and then, and we need to get into Iraq, to pursue justice, blah, blah, blah. Um, Same old storybook, in my opinion. Same playbook gets used. It doesn't matter if it was 160 years ago or in today's time period. But yeah, I did want to touch on the whole trial because um, it's very interesting. It doesn't get talked a lot about how John Surratt Jr., who was the second in line, who by all accounts was the second man right under John Wilkes Booth. John Surratt Jr., um, he was in New York, as I stated earlier. When he heard the news that Lincoln had been killed, he didn't want to be part of that, so he bailed out to Canada, then made his way over to England, and from there went to Italy, where he became a papal zouave. Um, and apparently, someone that recognized him from Maryland was also in the papal zouave, reported him. Um, the Vatican even said, "We have John Surratt Jr. here. We'll hand him over to you." And it's very super interesting that the American government didn't really want him brought in. Then he makes his way to Alexandria, Egypt, where he's finally arrested and brought over. And he went to trial, and that's where Henry Rathbone dusted off his script and gave the same verbatim speech as he did in
Right.
the first two times. And uh, John Surratt Jr. gets acquitted 8-4. He's found not guilty. So all these other folks were hung immediately. And to me, that's evidence that goes to show that the other trials were completely rigged against, the alleged co-conspirators.
Right.
What are your thoughts on this sham trial?
Well, first of all of the defendants, the 8 of them, were denied a jury trial, which under the Constitution they should have been given. Edwin Stanton, the man who set up Lincoln's assassination, took charge of the investigation of Lincoln's assassination, which should have probably fallen under the jurisdiction of the Attorney General. But Edwin Stanton, by falsely claiming that the Southern government had ordered the assassination of Lincoln, he claimed it was an act of war. Therefore, it fell under the War Department's jurisdiction. Therefore, he immediately took charge of the trial, and no one else challenged him. As to the trial itself, it's documented in Otto Eisenschimmel's book, published in 1937, Why Was Lincoln Murdered? He has about 20 pages documenting, and this is from the House Judiciary Committee's investigation of the Lincoln trial, that all of the witnesses against Jefferson Davis and the Confederate government were perjured, and they fell apart under cross-examination and admitted they had lied. The South was not behind Lincoln's assassination. Edwin Stanton, the war secretary, was, no matter what modern mainstream historians try to tell you. The trial was a complete sham. The prisoners, all 8 of them, were kept in solitary confinement. Even their guards were not allowed to speak to them, nor were they allowed to speak to their guards. At all times, they had hoods over their heads, as you've mentioned. These were canvas hoods, and they only had a small hole for breathing and eating food. but even at mealtime, um, the hoods were not taken off. Bear in mind that all times their legs and hands were shackled, their hands were handcuffed, and the guards took pity on them. And although we're forbidden to do this, one guard would feed the prisoner while the other guard stood watch. This is cruel, unusual punishment, which is forbidden in the Bill of Rights. And these masks were invented by Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War. They were not given defense counsel until the trial began, whereas the prosecution, which was entirely appointees of Secretary of War Stanton, had a whole month to prepare their cases. Every objection raised by the defense during the trial was overruled. But of 54 objections raised by the prosecution, only 3 were overruled. 51 were sustained. Um, this was a complete sham trial. Um, when they learned of their death sentences, including Mary Surratt, they were only given 24 hours to live. Usually, when a person is given a death sentence, they're given at least a couple of weeks to live before death sentence is pronounced, but they were given just 24 hours. And if you read my book or Isaac Schimmel's books, you'll see that even Mary Surratt, the first woman to be executed by the United States, um, she was denied final sacraments by her Catholic priest. Um, uh, unless he vowed and signed a promise not to say anything about Mary Surratt's innocence. It was a complete sham, this trial. And those who were not hung, 4 of the 8 were hung. The other 4 were sentenced to prison hard labor, and they were sent to the most remote prison imaginable. This was a prison that is to the west of Key West. I didn't even know there were islands west of Key West until I read about the Lincoln trial. There was
I visited there
yeah,
about a year and a half ago.
really, okay, that's
Yeah,
amazing. I've
I
never
went.
been down there. Fort Jefferson was on an island west of Key West, and the Secretary of War Edwin Stanton ordered they be placed in solitary confinement at this remote island, which is ridiculous. He just didn't want any family members or news reporters to interview them. Why would they have to be in solitary confinement when they're already in the most remote prison in the history of the United States? It makes no sense unless Stanton wanted to silence
Paranoid.
them, yeah, and make sure that they didn't talk. Um, uh, he wanted them all hung. You can be sure of that. Samuel Arnold, who was one of the falsely accused conspirators, and we need to get a John Wilkes Booth diary to document this, but which was withheld from the trial. But
Yes.
uh, he had no part in the Lincoln assassination, but he was sentenced to life in prison at this island west of Key West to make sure that he would never talk to the public.
Yeah, and he and O'Laughlin died after only a couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Samuel Mudd was there, and he's an interesting character. I don't know what to make
Definitely. Yeah.
about him, pro or bad about him. And there's conflicting stories whether he actually knew Booth and was hiding him out. He claims Booth was wearing a disguise, even
Mm-hmm.
though Booth didn't wear a disguise when he was going through his rampage. rampage. Um, but anyways, yeah, Dr. Mudd. Apparently, there was a plague that broke out in the prison, and
Right.
he
Yellow
saved
fever. Right.
everyone,
Right.
and he ended up getting his sentence commuted by Johnson later on,
Right.
which is very interesting as well. But it's also interesting how many people have been documented that were out helping out Booth while while he was on the lam. There were several people, but and there were also thousands of arrests. There were many people, especially actors, that
Mm-hmm.
were viewed as suspects. Immediately after the aftermath. Um, And interestingly enough, none of the Booth family, who were also actors, were ever held as suspects, but
Right.
all the other actors were. That's a funny little tidbit. Reminds me of how after 9/11, all the flights were canceled, but the Osama, family was allowed to book a plane and leave.
Right.
Yeah,
Correct.
while all the
Very
planes are
true. Yeah.
grounded. Yeah,
Very
it's
true.
it's very, very, there's many of these similarities that I've been able to, like, the more you learn about all these other things, when you see them playing out in a different instance, whether it's generations later, you're like, hey, I remember that story. That's similar to this. And I see a lot of these similarities, even in the Lincoln assassination. But I want to, I don't know if you, would you like a small little break, Mr. Perloff?
No, that's okay. We can keep
Okay.
going. We're okay. Yeah.
Okay. I just want to make sure you are comfortable.
Thanks for
Uh,
asking. Yeah. Thanks for asking. Yeah.
no problem. So I want to get into that segues into the whole Booth escape, because that's an interesting story in itself. As we mentioned at the very beginning, they crossed over through the Navy Yard bridge. Um, First Booth, and then followed by Harold, and something that never gets brought up by historians is why Stanton never closed down that bridge. I mean, the manhunt, everybody was on a wild goose chase with the telegram lines being down for a couple of hours, and then sending everyone north and northeast, or northwest, but no one to the Navy Yard bridge. uh Super, super weird. And then you have Silas Cobb, the guard at the Navy Yard bridge, that he was told not to let anyone in, but somehow he allows Wilkes Booth to cross. And then later on, he allows old Davy Harold to cross over. Um, what are the odds of that? you know,
Very low. There was a curfew in effect in Washington D.C. that I'm going to read. Let me see if I can find the exact order. Um, let's see. Excuse me, just a moment here. Um, okay, here are the official orders in Washington D.C. at the time of Lincoln's assassination. Quote: no person excepting general officers would be passed over any of the several crossings between the hours of 9 p.m. and daylight without the countersign and a pass. End quote. Now, John Wilkes Booth lived in Washington a great deal. This order had been in effect for about 2.5 years. He had to know that Washington had a curfew in effect. Um, so it's very important that he gets across the Navy Yard Bridge. Everybody had acknowledged that John Wilkes Booth was the assassin. In fact, by midnight on April the 14th, 17 people had already testified at police headquarters that John Wilkes Booth was the assassin, and many more testified to that effect at the Peterson House, where Lincoln was in his throes of death, and where Stanton was. So everybody knew that John Wilkes Booth was the assassin. Yet somehow he gets across the bridge, the Navy Yard bridge that takes him into southern Maryland. Um, why did Sergeant Silas Cobb let Booth cross against military orders? And then, Booth actually came up and he said, "My name is Booth," very brazenly. And according to Cobb's account, which is the only account of we have of this encounter, um, Booth said the reason he was out so late was because he wanted the moon to come up so he could see the roads better. So Cobb lets him pass. And then Davy Harold, Booth's writing companion, comes up, and Booth really needs him to show him the roads of Maryland. Um, David Harold is told by Silas Cobb, "Sorry, kid, nobody can cross after 9 o'clock." This is about 10:30, 10:40. Um, and Cobb says, "Well, why do you out so late, kid?" And um, David Harrell says, "Well, I had a, you know what it is, sir. I had a tryst with a young lady, but I've got to get home to my home in Maryland." So Cobb lets him pass. Um, the the question is, why is it that Edwin Stanton, who took charge of the investigation, and so ruthlessly holds accountable people like um, uh, the scene shifter at the Ford's Theater. Um, why does he put him in solitary confinement with a hood over his head? But he does not punish either the bodyguard who deserted his post or Sergeant Cobb, who let the president's assassins uh, pass the bridge in violation of military orders. Why are they not punished? This is a question that
Or
mainstream
even
historians,
Boston Corbett.
right, and that's the next one we need to get to is Boston Corbett, who shot Booth at the
Yeah,
Garrett's farm.
allegedly. Anyways, that's disputed as well whether it was actually
Mm-hmm.
him that shot Booth, and then there's other people that wonder if that was even Booth's corpse.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of
Right.
questions regarding um, that whole transaction as well. Yeah, I'm truly fascinated by this. I've been wanting to have a conversation like this, Mr. Perloff, and even throw at you some of the questions that I had because they've been um, tickling my mind, and because there's not too many people that cover this topic. I wasn't sure who I can ask, and if I ask these same questions or bring up these same concerns to people that just strictly stick to the official narrative there,
Mm-hmm.
they would dismiss me as completely loony.
Right.
So I'm truly enjoying having this conversation, and like I said, the whole point of it was for people that have been invested to hear different points of views, and maybe things that they hadn't thought before. It could give them a different look into the whole event, if you will. Yeah, I don't know if you wanted to go into the actual escape, or if you wanted to just jump into the whole Garrett's barn deal.
Yeah, that should be next, really. You're correct. Um, Here's what Otto Eisenschimmer wrote in 1937, quote, only one hole was left in the network that Stanton had spun around the nation's capital. This was the road that pointed straight south from Washington to Port Tobacco. It was the road that Booth was most likely to use, for it led to the Confederacy, the only place where the assassin could hope to find protection. And all the wires sent out from the War Department during the night of April the 14th, this route was not mentioned once, and no precautions were taken to guard it. The only road that Stanton failed to bar was the one by which Booth escaped from Washington, and there never should have been any slight doubt that he would have used it. End quote. Now I'm going to talk about why Stanton knew Booth was going to use the route. This is the exact same route Booth had already planned to use for his kidnapping attempt on Lincoln a month earlier, which is well documented. Stanton had a network of 2,000 spies, including Louis Weichman, who lived in the Surratt boarding house and was reporting all the plans for the kidnapping plan. Um, Stanton knew that Booth was going to use this route, and yet it's the one route he left unprotected. He knew that Booth was going to use that route, and he did not detach any soldiers to guard it. Now, I should mention that Louis Weichman's supervisor in the War Department was named Daniel Gleason, and in his article for the Magazine of History of 1911, he documented that he was reporting all of Weichman's reports up to his superiors, and he said these went to Secretary Stanton. Now, Stanton burned his own paper trail, but according to Captain Gleason, Stanton was getting the reports on Booth's plan to kidnap the president. And you can be sure, with a network of 2,000 spies and probably the most powerful man in Washington, Stanton certainly knew about it, and many of Booth's accomplices in the kidnapping plot, including Samuel Arnold and including John Surratt, dropped out of the kidnapping plot because they realized the government knew all about it. So Stanton knew all about it, and but that's the road that he leaves unpatrolled after the assassination. Now Captain Gleason, who was Weichmann's supervisor, went to the War Department when he heard the news of the assassination. He said, "I know what road they're taking. They're taking the road down to Surrattsville," which is correct. He said, "Give me a troop of cavalry. I will chase them down that road." He was told, "No, Captain Gleason, you'll be of more service to us here in the War Department." He was denied the right to pursue Booth down the road that he knew Booth was taking. So let me throw it back to you. We can get to Sergeant Boston Corbett and the assassination attempt next, but let me throw it back to you.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of so many characters, and I think there's not enough time, unfortunately, to go through them all. But some other interesting characters that we probably won't get too much into, but I do want to mention them briefly. Are Kate Thompson, the spy, and then Miss Slater, the French spy. These were women. Kate Thompson was, I believe, the first female American spy, and she apparently had infiltrated the Mary Surratt home and got all that down low intel along with Louis Weichmann, and she kind of disappears from history. Same thing with Miss Slater. But
Right.
I found it interesting that these female characters way back then were doing some pretty wild spy work, and don't get credit. I'm not saying they were doing glorious things, but it's interesting that they were playing a rather key role in this whole plot, if you will.
Right. Kate Thompson, also known as Kate Warren, was in fact the first official American female spy. She worked for the Pinkerton Detective Agency, and she was critical in foiling the plot by the Knights of the Golden Circle, who planned to assassinate Lincoln in 1861 in Baltimore. Sarah Slater, who you mentioned, was brought in for questioning by the War Department, but there's no records of what happened to her, and she wound up in Poughkeepsie, New York, which, interestingly enough, is where several of the characters involved in the Lincoln assassination derived from. And she died there in 1920, but there's no record as to why she was released, or even though she was a known Confederate spy. A lot of these people appear to have been double agents working for both sides, and that is one of the dangers that Louis Weichmann ran into. He was a double agent. He worked for the War Department, but he also pretended to John Surratt to be interested in helping out with the kidnapping. And so when the trial came about, Stanton took him into the War Department and manacled and threatened him, even put a rope around his neck and said, "This is what we're going to do to you if you don't testify on behalf of the War Department, the prosecution." So he perjured himself and said that Mary Surratt was involved with the assassination attempt against President Lincoln. Um, uh, this is again something that becomes very risky with being a double agent. You can be accused of being working for either side. If you go back to the American Revolution, there was a guy named Benjamin Church who was working for the Americans, but also working for the British in Massachusetts. And George Washington had a trial for him to see if he was guilty of treason. The trial could never figure out if he was really working for America or for the British. So they didn't hang him. They sent him into exile to the West Indies. They just couldn't figure out if, as a double agent, he was really working for the British or really working for the Americans. And that was kind of the position that Louis Weichmann found himself in. But he finally gave up and he testified for the prosecution.
Horatio Gates is another character that comes to mind in talking about double loyalties and such.
Mm,
Yeah, there seems to be quite a bit of that even way back then and today. One of the, and I don't want to get sidetracked too much, but one of the earliest in trying to research what is the first official American history or conspiracy, and it is the Newburgh conspiracy that happened shortly after the Revolutionary War. And every time I bring it up, a lot of people have never even heard of that one. But the Newburgh conspiracy, we are told. Do you know anything about that, Mr. Perloff?
I really don't. So you better fill me in as along with your
Yeah,
listeners.
yeah, that one is awesome. I want to do a show on it at some point. But it's basically shortly after the Revolutionary War, there wasn't a lot of funds to pay the veterans of the Revolutionary War
Mm,
their money, and
sure.
so some people speculate that John Adams kind of wrote a letter trying to instigate some kind of a, a revolt. Um, and some of the soldiers were in mutiny. They weren't getting paid. They were hungry. They had served their country, and where the hell's the money? And so the tensions were high, and we are told, the official tale tells us, that George Washington, being the elder statesman that he was, already losing his eyesight, puts on his glasses, cries a little bit, and says, "Come on, guys, basically we had to fight for this. Stick it. Let's stick it out." And he quells any division, and we are told um, basically the bankers were the ones instigating the soldiers to fight. Like, hey, you guys aren't getting paid, we'll pay you guys. And basically George says, no, this was the whole point of the war, was to get away from that system. That's what the official tale tells us about the
Mm,
Newburgh conspiracy. My gut tells me that that's all a sham. That's exactly when the bankers took over, and we've been under their control ever since. But it's a good tale to hear, I suppose, of
mm.
the legendary Washington. Just like so many of these other tales that we are often told and told to accept as gospel, and that's why I question so many parts of not just this, but so many other things. Um, let's see. I don't want to get too sidetracked, but I did want to touch, come back and touch back on Booth on the Run.
Mm.
One of the interesting things about it is how they planned this out that day, I suppose, but they did it. They did so without any provisions. They, and James Swanson, a guy that sticks to the official tale, says that's because speed is what they needed and it worked effectively. They got the heck out of Dodge, rather quick. Okay, sure. I guess that's a good reason why they went off without any provisions. But apparently Booth had time to drill holes and make planks the perfect size door.
Mm.
He had no time for provisions. And okay, well, maybe Booth needed the lightning quick speed, even though he broke his leg on that landing. That's what he needed, I suppose. So he couldn't have any provisions with him. So why? This is my own thought. Why didn't Davy Harold, who did nothing essentially except accompany Booth, he didn't do anything when Lewis Powell was going Rambo mode at the Seward home. Instead, he fled the scene, and then why wasn't he loaded up with provisions? Extra meals, maybe some extra blankets. That's an interesting question that pops to my mind.
Yeah, and the answer is that Booth Booth's plot to assassinate the president did not originate until the day of the assassination itself, April the 14th, 1865. This is confirmed in what remains of his diary, which is very, very heavily censored. But both Lewis Powell, who attacked Secretary of State Seward, and George Atzerodt, the alleged attempted assassin of the Vice President Andrew Johnson. That is a very, very tenuous story. Both of them said to their attorneys and to detectives that they had no knowledge of a plot of assassination until 8 p.m. on the night of the assassination. So this was very um, um, spontaneous, and there wasn't a lot of time for Booth to plan for something like provisions. But I do believe that he did have a plan of escape. It was the same plan of escape he was going to use for the kidnapping plot, which had been planned well in advance. He had a boat waiting for him on a creek of the Potomac, but he was not able to get there due to his broken leg. He had to divert to the west to see Dr. Samuel Mudd, who he knew very slightly, to have his broken leg fixed. It was that broken leg that blew everything for Stanton and for Booth. And after having his leg repaired by Dr. Mudd and resting there for several hours, he should have rested there, Louis, for 2 weeks if he could have, but he couldn't. He continued on his escape, but Booth and Harold now had to improvise their escape. And this is why they were caught at the Garrett farm on April the 26th, 1865. They did not get to um, maintain their original plan of escape, which was that boat on the Creek of the Potomac, which they already purchased.
Very and that's an interesting thing too about the whole Booth diary. Uh and I'm trying to figure out where I can go without skipping too much ahead, or because I don't want to lose people, because I think you and I are getting a little deep, and this may be a little deeper than some
Sure.
other
This
folks.
is deep. This is deep. This definitely.
Yeah, this is real
This is much
deep.
deeper than any mainstream historian will go. That's for
Yeah.
sure.
And so these are details that we're covering, and even though we may not see eye to eye in all of them, I mean, they're food for thought, and I think this is what makes it fun. But going back to the Booth diary, that people that believe that, I don't know. So my stance on Booth dying at Garrett's barn, I haven't made my mind up one way or the other.
Right.
I think there's good arguments that he did die there, but I also think there's good arguments that it wasn't him that was there. And what makes me entertain that is how the autopsies conducted. Two of the doctors, one said it was the right limb, the other one said it was the left limb. And one of the doctors that knew Booth personally said that the corpse was freckled, and he doesn't remember ever seeing freckles on Booth. It looked nothing like him. So you have that, and then you have an Osama bin Laden type of deal where they get rid of the body quick, mission accomplished.
Right.
So there's lots of legitimate questions when it comes. It's not, in my opinion, it's not crazy to think this way, because there are many questions in general regarding the official tale. But one of the things that people will say that confirms Booth, that was Booth's body, will say, well, there was the diary was there on on the corpse, and
Mm.
that's what proves it. And then the fact that Edwin Stanton kind of basically hid the diary for a
Correct.
couple of years,
Definitely did. Yeah.
and And like you stated earlier, many pages were ripped and
Mm,
altered. And as Don Thomas mentions in his books, in the 70s, the FBI did forensics on the Booth diary, and they figured that there were there was a lot of screwing around with this
mm,
document. There
definitely.
was pages removed, there was pages glued back on. And so when I read these things, to me, it kind of lends credence that maybe Booth wasn't killed. And an interesting thing is how in the Booth diary, Booth declares himself as being an instrument of God, essentially for what he did, right? And in the Surratt home, Mary Surratt, when she's being questioned by the authorities, says um, that Wilkes Booth was the instrument of God. In doing what he's did, and I found that super strange. So, how the heck did Mary Surratt know what was in the diary when the diary was kept a secret and basically hidden for a couple of years? I found that super interesting. Um, what are your thoughts on that?
I should mention that I'm not familiar with that quote from Mary Surratt about Booth doing God's will.
I
She,
highlighted it
she
here.
was a very devout woman, and she went to mass. I'm not a Catholic myself, never have been, but she went to mass on Holy Thursday, which is the night before the assassination, and she also went to mass on the day of the assassination, Good Friday. A very religious woman, very unlikely to be a conspirator in the assassination, in which her own priest um, pointed out. Um, the As far as Booth being the man in the barn, I know that many stories, multiple stories, have evolved over the years about who was really in the barn, and I do believe that not only because the two best researchers that I think on the Lincoln assassination, Otto Eisenschimmel and Don Thomas, reached this conclusion, but also I do agree with them that Booth was the man in the barn. Now, one reason, a strong reason for believing that, Booth was brought to the Garrett farm by three Confederate officers. They discussed the assassination at length with Booth. Booth showed them his tattoo, which he had from childhood, JWB on um, his hand. Um, and when Booth was shot and laid on the Garrett farm, the porch of their house, he lived for about 3 hours after being shot. Um, all of the Garrett farm people, the father, mother, and the sons, all believe this is the same man who had originally arrived there as John Wilkes Booth. I believe it was Booth. His Everything he said was in character with Booth. He said, "Tell my mother I died for my country." John Wilkes Booth had written a letter to his mother on the day of the assassination. He was very concerned about his mother. I just don't. If people say that it was really another man, um, named
Boyd.
Boyd,
Yeah.
but Boyd was 42 years old. Booth was 26. Boyd was 6'2", and Booth was 5'8". Boyd is not a good substitute for Booth at all. I believe that John Wilkes Booth did die at that farm. Um,
I do
but
think it's interesting though how, and I'm sorry to interrupt,
sure,
how uh, Alexander Gardner um, took a photographic plate of Booth, and that plate was destroyed either by um, Lafayette Baker or one of his cronies, um,
mm, right.
and so that fuels the conspiracy theories that Booth is alive because I if you show the plate of deaths or of Booth's face, everyone would confirm. There'd be no question. but the fact that the plate was destroyed is rather interesting. Why else would you destroy the plate? In my opinion, there is no good reason to destroy the plate of Wilkes Booth's face, or corpse. I can't think of a good reason for it.
Uh, what I conclude in my book is that it wasn't so much for public identification that that photograph was taken. I think that Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, wanted to make sure it was Booth, and because he didn't really trust his, um, he'd appointed a special detachment to go down and get Booth. Anybody could have gotten Booth, but he appointed a special detachment, including the cousin of the head of the Secret Service, Luther Baker, was cousin of
Luther Baker,
Lafayette
yeah.
Baker, the head of the Secret Service. I think Booth was assassinated, and Stanton just wanted to make sure for his own purposes that it was really Booth that they got. I don't think he took that photograph for public um, display. But again, there are arguments, and you refer to the doctor who had expressed doubts about whether or not it was really Booth. That doctor, if you read his full testimony, he says it was Booth. He said that Booth unmistakably had the mark of his scalpel on his on his back, and he performed surgery on Booth on his back, and he had no question in his mind whether or not that was John Wilkes Booth. But he did say at the time that um, cast was the cast was on his right leg, not the left, which is wrong. But he's saying that 20 years later. I think he really got mixed up because the original doctors, including the Surgeon General, all said the cast was on the left leg, which was correct. I think that 20 years later, Dr. May, who made these remarks about Booth, uh, expressing doubts about it being Booth, was simply mistaken in his recall of which leg had the cast on it. But again, what I say in my book is that there's arguments on both sides, and I leave the door open to this not being John Wilkes Booth, but I think the preponderance of evidence is that it was John Wilkes Booth.
Yeah, and that's what I enjoyed about your book. That you weren't like this is the only way to look at it. 100%. You can't question it. I don't. To me, that kind of thinking turns me off right away. Like,
Sure.
you weren't there, neither was I. How do you know for a fact that this is exactly what went on? You don't. All you can do is put the best pieces of evidence. So that I found that's on Don Thomas's book, The Reason Lincoln Had to Die,
Mm-hmm.
page 128. Near the top,
Mm-hmm.
it says, Booth justified his act by claiming, God simply made me the instrument of his punishment. What stands out about this phrase is that a month later, Louis Weichmann accused Mary Surratt of having said, I think J. Wilkes Booth was only an instrument in the hands of the Almighty to punish. So I found that super interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Come across that um, for a variety of reasons. I mean, uh, to me, it puts that whole diary in itself. You even start to question, okay, what what did Wilkes really write, with all the shenanigans that went on with pages missing and pages being add on? What if there was a narrative at play, to fuel whatever storyline that needed to be on, but maybe it didn't sit well, and maybe that's why it was kept away for a while. I don't know. There's so many ways that you can go about this. Um, I did want to mention a character that we have talked about quite a bit. Do you need a break, Mr. Perloff?
No, that's okay. That's okay.
Okay. Um, and that is this guy right here, Mr. Lafayette C. Baker. Super interesting character. In many ways, even his short ending. But he was very this is what cracks me up when you listen to official mainstream historians regarding Edwin Stanton. As I previously stated, they state him as a good guy, someone that really loved Lincoln, and someone that uprooted corruption. This is the kind of things that you will often hear about regarding Stanton. I quickly laugh at that because one of Stanton's favorite guys was this guy, Lafayette Baker, who was a very dubious guy in many ways. And even during Booth's escape, he was, in my mind, no question in it for the money, the reward money. There was a substantial amount of monies
Mm.
that was out for the capture of Wilkes Booth. And him and his cousin and another gentleman, who was it Conger? I can't
Yeah,
remember.
Everton Conger. Yeah,
Yeah.
Conger. Yeah.
And they thought they had hit the lottery. And in the end, they I think Everton and Luther each got $5,000, and I think Lafayette only got $3,000, which doesn't sound like a lot, but back then it was still a good chunk of change,
Mm.
but not nearly the 20,000 that they thought they were going to get, and split three ways. And so in my mind, that's kind of what made Lafayette turn on Edwin Stanton. This is my own little gatherings from the little bit of research that I've done. It almost seems like that was the turning point where Lafayette was, oh man, I'm only going to get 3,000 after all I've done. And he ends up writing a book called The History of the Secret Service.
Right.
And it's in that book that we find out that Lafayette Baker basically turns Edwin Stanton in and says he's the one with the Booth diary. And that's when everyone's like, really? So there is a Booth diary. And that's when it was uncovered. But it's really because I feel, and I'd like to hear your opinions. I feel like Lafayette turned on Edwin Stanton because Lafayette Baker was he was a scummy character. He would shake down. He was known to shake people down, and he was as corrupt as you can get. And this was one of Stanton's main guys. What are your thoughts on that? Am I off base with that? With that?
No, you're correct. He was a shakedown artist, and but the reason he had a falling out with Stanton was that in 1867, the president Andrew Johnson caught Lafayette Baker spying on President Johnson in the Oval Office, and he demanded that Baker be fired as head of the
Yeah,
Secret Service. Now, Stanton was unwilling to challenge the president on this, and this caused a break between Stanton and Lafayette Baker. So in 1867, as you mentioned, Lafayette Baker wrote a book called History of the Secret Service, in which he revealed to the public's first knowledge that John Wilkes Booth had kept a diary. And he quoted passages from that diary that you will not see in the remnants of the diary that are online today. So, and then Lafayette Baker was quickly disposed of. He died at the age of 41 in 1868.
and they suspect of arsenic, right?
Right. His doctor thought he had all the symptoms of arsenic poisoning, but because he couldn't figure out how he could have been poisoned, he wrote that he died of, I'm sorry, I forget the term, meningitis on
Yeah,
the death certificate. But Lafayette Baker revealed that the diary had been in existence, and this was critical evidence that was withheld
yeah,
at the trial of the co-conspirators of John Wilkes Booth. Had that diary been revealed, it would have shown that John Wilkes Booth had no plot to kill the president until the day of the assassination, which meant that some of the people sentenced at the trial could not have possibly been guilty. For example, Sam Arnold who was sentenced to life in prison at hard labor. He'd been in Fort Monroe, Virginia, 180 miles away from Washington for 2 weeks, and he had not communicated with John Wilkes Booth during that time. He could not possibly have known of a plot to assassinate the president, yet he was convicted on that basis. Same thing with Dr. Samuel Mudd. Um, it's been said, how would anybody have ever heard of Dr. Samuel Mudd's name if Booth didn't break his leg? He didn't know about a plot in Washington to kill the president on April the 14th. So innocent people were hung or sentenced to life in prison based upon uh, false testimony and the withholding of that diary. The withholding of that diary was critical. It was obstruction of justice on the part of Edwin Stanton and the chief prosecutor at the trial, Joseph Holt, who knew about it, as well as Thomas Eckert, who, as I've mentioned, became head of Western Union after he left the government. He knew about the diary. None of these people revealed the existence of the diary, which was
Mm.
critical evidence. And there was a U.S. Congressman, Benjamin Butler, who demanded to know why it was that Booth's tobacco pipe was introduced in evidence at the trial, but not his diary, which contained his plans. It made no sense. And it still makes no sense to this day. And we can get into the FBI's analysis of that diary. But let me just throw it back to you.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And the other, you know, we've already gone over the whole sham of the trial, but it's also, especially by these people that stay with the official narrative, never bring up the fact of that manufactured evidence was introduced. There was a cipher letter that was allegedly recovered from a river, that was introduced as evidence, but that showed no water damage.
Right,
And you
right,
also
right.
had some of these witnesses. Um, can't remember the guy's name, but there was one witness in particular that ran a school for perjured witnesses.
Right. Mm,
You
right.
literally can't make these things up. It's
All the
insane.
evidence against Jefferson Davis being behind the assassination was perjured, all of it. And if you look at Eisenschimmel's book, published in 1937, page 211 on, he gives example after example of people who were hired to perjure themselves against Jefferson Davis. None of the evidence against Jefferson Davis in the South was honest. It was all perjured.
Yeah, that's another strike against the people that stick with the official narrative. So many shenanigans could easily be pointed out. I did, and for those, this is Otto Eisenschimmel's. This book I got for like $5 on eBay, and it is an original. The copyright is
Mm,
1937 on it,
right.
and it made me laugh on the about the author. It speaks about Mr. Otto Eisenschimmel in the present tense. Mr. Otto was born in 1880, and he is currently a professor here and there. Yeah, this book right here, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is one of the original books that questioned the Lincoln assassination, and it inspired many authors such as yourself,
Mm,
such as David McGowan, such as Don Thomas, and so on and so forth. This is an amazing book. I'm only 50 pages deep, and I can see why it inspired folks like yourself.
mm.
Truly a fascinating read. But um, going back, do you need a break, Mr. Perloff?
No, we're okay. We're okay. Yeah.
Okay, great. Um, I'm I'm enjoying this. I'm trying to make sure we cover all the little questions that I wanted to ask, because, like I said, this is something that I've wanted to go in depth for quite a while,
Mm,
and as mentioned, not a lot of people cover it. and it could be one of these fringe things that people going. Okay, here's an interesting little tidbit. So let's see. Okay, I've got a few notes here. Um, L.A. Godright, he was a uh, a journalist that he is credited as being the one that found the one shot Derringer in the booth,
Mm,
which is very reminiscent of how the magic bullet was later found on that infamous gurney
mm,
while hauling Connolly away. You know, why was it a journalist that found the one shot Derringer? I suppose everyone was in a panic and wasn't paying attention. But I do, that's another tidbit that I forgot to mention that I found interesting, that, it took a journalist to find it after hearing upon, the news of the president. Okay, so the other, um, I did want to make, I don't know how you feel about the Trump assassination, or I may call it a alleged assassination, but I found very many similarities. One of those that I told you about earlier was how Trump turned his head at the right moment, and that's what made him survive the alleged attempt.
mm,
Lincoln turned his head at the wrong moment, and that's what got him killed. And when you study Trump and his admiration for Lincoln, and he's even said that he views Lincoln as like a he's competing against Lincoln, I guess, for legacy purposes, blah, blah, blah. It's also interesting that I brought up Alexander Gardner as the photographer of Booth's death
mm,
plate. He also photographed those pictures, that picture of Lewis Powell, as well as all the co-conspirators. He also photographed Abraham Lincoln's death plate as well.
mm,
So
right. Mm,
this photographer was just everywhere apparently, and sure, there weren't many photographers at the time, but at the same time, I mean, pretty wild odds. Which, if, in a similar fashion, if you look at the Trump assassination, you have Alexander, or I'm sorry, that was Alexander Gardner. You
mm,
have Douglas Mills, who infamously took a picture of George Bush getting the news of the attacks on 9/11, and then took a picture and caught, using a camera with 20 frames per second, caught the bullet that allegedly grazed Trump's ear. What are the odds this photographer's at the right place at the right moment? Um, not just once in a million lifetime shots, a couple once in a lifetime million shots, by these guys. So that was another little fun tidbit that I picked up on my own. I've found quite a bit. I mentioned earlier how there you tend to see similar things getting repeated, like the fact that John F. Parker, as we talked about, instead of doing his duty and protecting the president, decided it was better to go get a drink and get drunk that night. It's eerily reminiscent to the Epstein guards falling asleep when they should have been
right. Good
watching
point. Yeah. Good point.
Jeff
Yeah.
Epstein. Yeah, as I've gone through these, I wrote a huge list, and I'm just trying to go off the top of my head the ones I remember. But so many of these things that get repeated, we see these things just coming up again. Um, but I suppose bringing it back to the sham trial, one of the biggest pieces of evidence that they try to use against the co-conspirators were all these alleged plots of um what is it, germ warfare from the 1800s that the South was alleged to be using, that they were going to fill
Mm,
blankets filled with these nasty diseases and then send them over to Union soldiers so that it would spread and kill them off. Those were all alleged plots, and were used against the co-conspirators. Now, if we're looking from a justice point of view, it doesn't matter what other people are planning. The people
Right.
are on trial are these people in front of us. Why does this other crap, whether it's real or not, bear any weight in court? And yet it was allowed to be used, against them. Just more shenanigans. Um, I'm sorry. Is And the other thing that I don't think we covered was the Booth Manifesto. Booth had a manifesto which, in modern times, when you look at a lot of these shootings, anytime I hear the word manifesto, my mind immediately goes to skeptic. I go to skeptic mode, and way back then, Booth already had a manifesto as to his whole dealings, which is, again, this is another reason why I have so many questions regarding the whole issue. When you look at uh, whatever event in modern times, these guys all have manifestos, every single time. It never fails. And with all these people having manifestos, when you look into them deeper, there are many legitimate questions, as far as these events. What are your particular thoughts on the Booth Manifesto?
Well, Booth manifesto would consist of basically of his diary, uh, which was kept a secret for 2 years. It was the most critical piece of evidence. It was not brought into evidence of the trial, which was clear obstruction of justice by the chief prosecutor, Joseph Holt, who knew about it, and Secretary of War Stanton, who was first shown it. That would have been Booth's manifesto. And I just want to quote the FBI analysis. In 1977, the FBI was asked by the forensic library to investigate the diary of John Wilkes Booth. And there were a couple of reasons for that. Some scholars thought that the diary had secret writing, which the investigation determined it did not. But the other reason was that some of the pages of John Wilkes Booth's diary were falling out, and it was felt that they would not be able to examine this diary much longer, so they wanted the FBI to look into it. Now, let me just quote first what Benjamin Butler, U.S. Congressman, said in 1867. He said, quote, that diary is now produced has 18 pages cut out, the pages prior to the time when Abraham Lincoln was massacred, although the edges show they had all been written over. Who spoliated that book? Who caused an innocent woman, meaning Mary Surratt, to be hung? End quote. Congressman Benjamin Butler, 1867. Now, 110 years later, the FBI looks at that diary, and here's what they said. It wasn't 18 pages missing. Let me quote their report, which you can find online. Quote, in total, there are 43 full sheets, 86 pages, because it's 2 pages to a sheet, right? In full, 83 full sheets, 86 pages are missing from the diary. 27 sheets, 54 immediately preceding April the 14th, which is the day of the assassination, were noted that many pages of that group of missing sheets contain portions of handwriting, which, if the missing pages were found later, would assist in any future examination relating to these pages. In other words, the 27 pages or 27 sheets or 54 pages leading up to the assassination were cut out, and the FBI, just like Congress in 1867, could see that you could still see on the edges of those pages John Wilkes Booth's handwriting, a letter, a punctuation mark. So these were not blank pages that were torn out. In addition to that, the FBI found that many other pages were missing. This included just about all of the financial transaction pages, which were in that diary, were missing. And in addition to that, the FBI found that um, certain pages had been removed, and then select pages had been re-glued. The phrase they use is relaminated into the diary. Um, what Don Thomas, who I consider one of the best modern investigator of the Lincoln assassination, points out is for those pages to be rebound into the diary, that's the phrase the FBI uses, they first had to be unbound. Now, how in the world was it possible for John Wilkes Booth to take pages out of his diary and then reglue them into the diary? That is not
Mhm.
possible. This was very careful work. And the people who did it were clearly the people in the War Department who kept Booth's diary a secret for 2 years. Why did they not allow that diary to be introduced at the trial? Because they had something to hide. And by the same token, they took out certain pages of John Wilkes Booth's diary, both before and after the assassination. And they only let the public and the Congress see the pages that they wanted them to see. This is clear evidence of Stanton's guilt and the War Department's guilt. They wanted to protect themselves and people who were their friends from any accusations. This is why 86 pages are missing from John Wilkes Booth's diary, and that is confirmed by the FBI's forensic lab.
Yeah, yeah, that's a key point right there. That had the Booth diary um, been introduced, I still feel the co-conspirators would have been hung because the unfortunately the cards were
Right.
stacked against all of
It
them.
was, it was
Uh,
yeah, it was rigged from the beginning. You're right. Yeah.
yeah. However, um, going back into the history books and going through this information, I think folks would have a different take on the whole affair. This is an interesting comment. This L.A. Gobright turned the Derringer over to Stanton crony Almarin C. Richards. Gobright later got fired from the AP in 1879. A.C. Richards' brother Zalman Richards was a founder of the YMCA Red Flag. Interesting little tidbit there
Mm.
from another Lincoln assassination enthusiast. Uh, I did want to. I know it's getting late, and and I don't want to keep you too late, but I think I mentioned to you once we do 2 hours, we're just gonna start getting warmed up, and I'm
Sure.
loving it. Yeah, we
Sure.
we could.
Yeah.
Yeah, we could down the line maybe do a part two and revisit some more of this because I'm loving it. I've been in nerd mode. I don't think I've ever gone so deep into a subject such as the Lincoln assassination, ever since I've read several books on it. And like I mentioned at the very beginning, I've been listening to lectures and even from the mainstream line because I don't want to live in an echo chamber where I'm all just conspiracy
Right.
thinking the
Sure.
whole time. I want to
Definitely.
know
Yeah.
the other side because sometimes
Right.
the other side may have some good points and I
Mm.
don't want to be shield myself from it. I want to take it all in. And
That's
and
good.
so yeah, after careful analysis of a lot of these things, I just, that's why I just I don't feel like I'm closer to any answers. Instead, I have even more questions, which is it's a weird predicament. I'm listening to these talks and I as they're talking, like I was listening to James Swanson, real quick. I was listening to James Swanson talk about his book Manhunt. Um, and he's talking and I'm in the living room and I'm yelling at the TV. That's complete speculation. But
Mm.
I'm yelling at the TV and my son's like, "Holy crap, dad, you're getting animated." I'm like, "Yes, it's pissing me off. This guy is saying things and passing it off as gospel and because he has the title as the authority on the Lincoln assassination, that's what people call him anyways. The premier Lincoln assassination scholar, blah blah blah. He's the man. And I'm sitting there
Uh-huh.
and I'm yelling at the TV. I'm like, that's a bunch of nonsense. And my teenager son is just laughing. He's like, "Holy crap, Dad, you've gone full nerd mode on this." I'm like, "Yes, I have. I I have gone fully invested, and and I hope at the very least people that have listened to the show, maybe some of this has gone a little over your heads and maybe you felt lost at times. You may what I what I would encourage you to do, I would encourage you to get Mr. Perloff's book. You can get it on Amazon, which is what I did, or go to his website, which is on the link of the description of the show. Read that book and then revisit this show and give it a second listen, and maybe then some things will make a little bit more sense, then. But um, like I said, I was looking at the clock. I'm like, holy crap, we are in. Uh, are there any final things? I don't. I'm only cutting it because I feel I'm abusing your stay, and I don't want
Well,
to do that.
we should wrap it up, but I should mention a couple of things. Isaac Schimmel's book, published in 1937, was a selection of the Book of the Month Club, which had almost 1 million members by World War II. And um, to get into the Book of the Month Club, you had to be very good. And Isaac Schimmel's research was first rate. He he talked to the son of Luther Baker, who had been one of the commanders of the detachment that shot John Wilkes Booth. He talked to a slave girl who was still living, who had been at the home of Thomas Jones, who shielded John Wilkes Booth. I mean, he went into the files of the Washington Metropolitan Police to find out more about Booth. I'm sorry, Lincoln's bodyguard, John F. Parker. I don't know anybody else has done that, but he did tremendous archival research. Very difficult to do in 1937. There was no such thing as an internet back then, but he did all the legwork necessary. The other thing I want to mention is that in 1971, on Lincoln's birthday, NBC Television produced a documentary nominated for an Emmy. It was produced by Wolper Productions, which did North and South and Roots and many other eminent productions on the Lincoln assassination, and asked the same questions we're asking here tonight. They asked why were the telegraph wires shut down right after the assassination? Why did Stanton fail to patrol the one road that Lincoln that Booth took? Why did Stanton deny Lincoln the protection he requested at Ford's Theater? And on and on. This was mainstream NBC television asking this very same questions we asked tonight. I've only covered a few of them that they asked. And yet today, Edward Steers is considered the authority in Lincoln assassination. All he does is uphold the original trial and say that they got it right and that the South was behind Lincoln's assassination. I have a very interesting section at the end of my book on why John Wilkes Booth did this assassination at Ford's Theater. He shouted what he shouted for a very specific reason. He shouted the state motto of Virginia, and the South is avenged. He could have killed Lincoln on the street, but he wanted it to be done in Ford's Theater, so it would be 1,500 witnesses to the idea that the South was behind the assassination, and which would not have happened if he shot Lincoln on the street. There was so much evidence that this was done to proceed with the brutal Reconstruction, the exploitation of the South. That was the real reason Lincoln was assassinated. It had nothing to do with a plot by the South. It was determined in advance that this would be blamed on the South. That's why it was done at Ford's Theater, and that's why Booth shouted what he did. You know, like a true actor, in spite of his broken leg, he said his prearranged lines. But that was what was really going on at Ford's Theater and with the Lincoln assassination. And it breaks my heart to see that so few people understand this. And this is why, in the year 2024, having read Eisen Schimmel's book 30 years ago, I said, you know what? People have to know the truth. They have to. And I found Don Thomas was the one author, modern author, who confirmed everything that Eisen Schimmel had discovered. And I said, we've got to bring this to the public's attention. The true reason that Lincoln was killed. Um, that was the reason. It was to pave the way for the Reconstruction, the exploitation of the South. That was the only reason he was killed. Um, that's the main point I would pass on to your viewers and listeners.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, next up on my books reading list is this one. Have you heard of this one? Return of the Assassin John Wilkes Booth by W.C. Jameson.
I have not seen that book. No, I've not seen that. No.
It's supposed to be pretty good and lays out a good case for Booth.
Right. When you're John Wilkes Booth, even in the small remnants of his diary that remain, says that he said he had half a mind to return to Washington to clear his name.
Yeah,
And he told his writing companion, David Harold, he said, listen, Harold, don't desert me because there are people in Washington who can implicate you in this murder. And so, why did John Wilkes Booth say he could return to Washington and clear his name? And why is he telling his writing companion, David Harold, that there are people in Washington who can implicate David Harold in the assassination? These
yeah.
are questions that are left unanswered and unasked by mainstream historians.
Yeah, and one little final thing about the barn that just popped into my head. One of the Garrett boys, who was 11 at the time, later on, um, he went by the Reverend Garrett.
Right.
Um, he stated that the barn, because the mainstream says that the Garretts locked Wilkes Booth and Davy in the barn. They locked
Right.
them from the outside, and they were locked inside. Um, the Reverend Garrett said that he remembers as a boy that the windows locked from the inside. So that's a weird little tidbit. Um, yeah, there's so many little things like these that just you're like, okay, what what really happened? What is going on? How much of the story is accurate? How much of it is propaganda? I mean, even that whole when you look at John Wilkes Booth, his dad was Junius Brutus Booth. We all know Brutus from the time of Caesar's. Uh, he in the conspiracy to kill Caesar, and then you fast forward all this time later in a Shakespearean-esque manner. Someone related to a Junius Brutus um, does essentially the same thing. There's so many of these things that just
Mm-hmm.
it, it almost sounds like it's too perfect, too perfect of a story in many ways, with all these little perfect lines coming out and coincidences. And we touched on quite a bit today. Um, I would definitely like to do another chat down the road because I truly had a blast with you, Mr. Perloff. And maybe we could even cover some of your other work because you are an author of several books. Is it 8 that you have written?
Correct. Yes.
Yeah.
Correct.
So yeah, I definitely look forward to reading more of your more of your work. Uh,
Thanks.
Remind the folks where is the best place to find your information as well as your books.
Well, my website is jamesperloff.net. That's Perloff with a P. And I'm on Twitter, Gab, and LinkedIn, and as far as social media accounts go. And all my books are available on Amazon except my COVID book, which was Amazon's #1 bestseller in the category of respiratory diseases for the first 2 months, and then they censored it without giving me any reason why. They simply took my COVID book off. Um, I'd been working on a book on 9/11, but when COVID happened, I realized this is so serious that I had to drop my work on 9/11 to write a book on COVID, which I worked flat out on for three months. But they censored it, and then I simply sold the book privately by a distributor who got into Barnes and Noble and Books A Million and other booksellers other than Amazon, who refused to give me a reason why this book, which was rated 92% 5 stars by customers and 8% 4 stars, and nobody gave it 1, 2, or 3 stars on Amazon. But Amazon claimed it was a bad experience for their
Oh,
customers, so they had to take it down. But other than that one book, all my books are available on Amazon.
beautiful. I'm gonna have to get that COVID book. Yeah, I live out here in Venice, Florida, which is a
Mm,
key role in 9/11.
9/11, right?
9/11, yeah.
Definitely, Venice came up many times with Muhammad Atta and his co-pilots.
Yeah.
Venice came up a lot. Yeah,
You know how we were talking about Abraham Lincoln coincidences?
yeah.
I'll give you some Venice trivia that you will not hear anywhere else. Um, it's super interesting that Muhammad Atta, um, so George Bush got the news of 9/11 out here in Sarasota at Booker Elementary.
Mm,
Booker Elementary is within walking distance of Muhammad Atta's favorite gentleman's club. Crazy coincidence, I suppose. Booker Elementary, where George Bush was at 9/11, is also 20 minutes away in Prestanza, eh, out here in Sarasota, Florida, as well, where in the 28 pages report, we find out that some rich Saudis that were funding the alleged hijackers also lived.
hmm,
So you have Muhammad Atta, you have Bush, you have the royal Saudis whose names were redacted. Why weren't we allowed to know the names of the people that were funding these alleged terrorists? I don't know.
hmm,
But to me that's a smoking gun that there's definitely inside job, even if you're skeptical of all these other claims. How do you explain the government redacting the name of the royal Saudis involved, and then instead we go into Iraq when the Saudi and Israeli fingerprints are all over 9/11, but
hmm.
we go and attack Iraq? It's a crock. But yeah, that those are little local Sarasota boy tidbits of 9/11 you
Hmm.
probably won't get anywhere else. Um, but yeah, we could definitely do a show on that. That's another
Oh,
one of my
definitely
favorite
9/11.
subjects.
9/11 is something that, like I say, I was working on intensively for months before COVID hit. But COVID just took priority because I could see that that was the new normal that they were introducing, and it
Yeah,
was extremely dangerous to the American public. I knew this as a registered nurse that you did not introduce a warp speed vaccine onto the public. Um, I was a registered nurse for 45 years. I knew that you didn't do this kind of thing, but it took priority. But 9/11, and I'm so glad to hear that you are down around Venice, Florida, because definitely that was a key place where what I would call Muslim patsies
yeah.
were operating prior to
Leaving
9/11.
fingerprints like Booth, leaving calling cards. You know how
Yeah,
Booth
yeah,
is
yeah,
leaving
yeah.
calling cards everywhere?
Right.
The Patsy terrorists were leaving calling cards everywhere as well.
Their passports, right? Yeah,
Yeah,
found at the World Trade Center. Yeah,
well, yeah, and they were
unburned. Yeah,
cast. Yeah, they were cast as religious Muslim extremist, and yet all the people that knew him, I had a neighbor that did drugs and went to strip bars with him. Um,
right, right.
they
Mm.
were not devout Muslim extremists by any means. They like
They
to party and do drugs.
they even left a copy of the Koran at one of those strip clubs. And what
Yeah,
devout Muslim would bring his Koran to a strip club? It
yeah,
makes no sense
makes no
unless
sense.
you are trying to plant a trail of evidence
Yeah,
that will
it-
incriminate Muslims in order to justify wars in the Middle East. That's
Yeah, and
more
I guess
nonsense.
real quick to tie it back to the Lincoln assassination, that's what cracks me up. Uh, when you look at Booth's, Booth was leaving calling cards at Ford's Theater. He left one when with Vice President Johnson. Excuse
Correct.
me to bug you. Are you home? He leaves allegedly. Some reports have him leaving a calling card when he crossed the Navy Yard Bridge. So this guy's just leaving. Here's some evidence crumbs here and there. I'm just throwing them out. That's what makes me skeptical even more about the whole.
Right. Well, Chadwick Booth did a lot of things to incriminate people who were hung. That includes George Atzerodt. George
Yes, we didn't talk
Atzerodt,
about
who
him.
was very flimsily accused of trying to assassinate Vice President Johnson. He had no motive. He was not a political man. He had no political motive to kill the vice president, and he was not being offered any money for it. Yet he signed the hotel register with his real name, and in his room was a mountain of incriminating evidence, including a bank book belonging to John Wilkes Booth and a handkerchief belonging to John Wilkes Booth's mother, Mary. Why would this small time gopher for John Wilkes Booth have things belonging to John Wilkes Booth in his possession and leave them at the hotel room? This was used to convict him and hang him at the trial. But it made no sense whatsoever they would have these things. And it raises the question, who planted these items in his hotel room? Was it a detective working for Lafayette Baker and Secretary of War Stanton? Or did John Wilkes Booth himself plant this evidence in Atzerott's hotel room? We will probably never know the true answer to
Yeah.
that. But it was extremely suspect. And the first person to draw attention to this as being a suspect was again Otto Eisenschimel, 1937.
And he
He
found the
said he said there's no
yeah.
way all this mountain of evidence would have been left behind by Atzerodt in the hotel room if he was really guilty of trying to assassinate the vice president. He would have taken that evidence with him. He would not have left it behind.
It's like
Evidence that convicted him and hung him.
yeah, it's like James Earl Ray after he's shooting Martin Luther King, leaving a bundle, leaving his gun and his whole
Yeah.
bundle of evidence
Yeah.
near the scene. This is what I mean. You find these similarities
Mm.
over and over and over
Yeah.
again. It's insane. I'm like, hey, so as soon as I hear something, I'm like, whoa, my brain just connects it. I'm like, that's just what happened here. And
Right.
even on my show, I bring up these Lincoln similarities, but I don't, and I think some of my audience has gone as deep. I showed one comment of at least one gentleman that left a pretty interesting comment there. But sometimes I bring these things up and I'm like, man, unless you have really gone deep, you won't know what I'm talking about. But
Right.
yeah, I think this was a great conversation. I would love to do it. And like I said, I really love to go down 9/11 myself.
Mm.
Um, and I've done a lot of little research. I was supposed to do a podcast with the late Daniel Hopsiker. He was my neighbor out here.
Oh, yes,
Um,
right. Okay.
and
Yeah,
we
Hopsinger wrote the definitive book on what went on with the hijackers in Florida. He definitely did. Yeah.
Florida. He did a great book on Barry Seal and the boys. A
Mm.
lot of great work, and I spoke with him a couple of months before he passed away of cancer.
Mm.
We
Mm.
were trying to make we were going to do a podcast, and unfortunately, we ran out of time.
Oh,
And
I'm
that's
real
one of the
sorry to hear that.
regrets.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It would
no,
have been a
he
great resource. He interviewed people like the the rental car rental dealers that gave
yes,
cars to Muhammad Atta and
and
his
they came
partner.
back and changed
Uh,
the paperwork around.
yeah, yeah, just a few days before 9/11, it's like
Yes,
Hopsick was asking, why are these guys concerned about who gets credit for renting the cars just 3 or 4 days before 9/11? It didn't make sense.
yeah,
Um, why not just leave it as it was? He asked great questions, and I'm sorry you didn't get to do that interview with him because I really felt that Hopsicker's book, which I read in my research on 9/11, was one of the really definitive books. He asked questions that the FBI and other investigators should have been asking about the hijackers in Florida that nobody else asked. Hopsicker's book
yeah.
was definitely amazing and a true resource. He interviewed Muhammad Atta's one-time girlfriend.
Girlfriend, yeah.
Yeah, that
She lives out where I live in my neighborhood.
yeah, right. I mean, he did amazing research on 9/11 and asked questions that nobody else asked.
Yeah, we definitely have to do. I have to show you some of that footage I've taken of the Gentlemen's Club, and you can see on the map it's walking distance from the school where George Bush got the
Hmm.
information. The
This I
house
didn't
that
know.
the
Yeah.
Yeah, the house that they used to rent is still looks exactly the same.
Hmm.
I've thought about purchasing that home and running like a little, I don't know, some theme park. Come
Yeah.
spend the night at Muhammad Ata's old home. So I'm joking around about that, but yeah, I have done my homework out here, living in this
Mm.
town, and it's funny how many people out here. There's a few that know, but some people are like, "Whoa, really?" Or "Who's Muhammad Atta?" They don't even know have any clue.
Right.
But that's what
It's
happens
been a
after
while
20
now
years.
since 9/11. I mean, we're talking 23 years, right?
Yeah.
So there are people who have grown up and not really known the basic facts concerning that case.
The thing is though, out here in Venice, and I don't want to take it too much longer, but the out here in Venice, the median age, this is what drew Hopsicker in here when he found out the median age out here. The median age, even in 2024, it's 69 years old.
Hmm.
Think about
Hmm.
that.
Well, that's
Median
kind of
age 69.
good in a way that people who are 69 years old have a perspective on what's been going on, whereas people who are only 20 years old, if they've only been treated to the mainstream narrative of what's happening in the country, really don't have that rear vision to see the changes that have taken place in our country.
Yeah, and I only brought that median age up because that's what attracted Daniel Hopsker out here. He's like, how were these 30, 40-year-old Muslims hiding out in Venice, Florida, where it's a bunch of 70 and 80 and 90, even centennials
Right.
out here.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
what piqued his interest. And then in the COVID era, that's what made me realize the whole thing was a scam. I'm out here by the beach in Venice, Florida, surrounded by people in their 70s, 80s, 100. I mean, that has to be the majority of the people there to make a
Mm.
median age of 69 to
Right.
account for all the younger
Mm.
folks. And so when I wasn't seeing piles of dead neighbors, I was like, yeah, this is all a sham. And and people were coming in from all over the world because Florida was wide open. People were going to the beaches. We never saw any craziness like they were showing on the news. And people that are COVID apologists, as I call them, can't explain that away every time I pose that. How come nothing happened out here in Venice, Florida? I never get a good answer for that one. So yeah, I'm sure we could have some more exquisite chats down the line. I truly enjoyed this, Mr. Perloff. I encourage everyone to check out Mr. Perloff's website down in the links. Purchase a book or two, and I look forward to doing this again. And thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It's been a long interview, but I've learned things from you. I didn't know about some of the things you mentioned about Venice, Florida, and it's good to cover the Lincoln assassination in detail because it truly was a done for ulterior motives, and it truly was arranged as a deep state operation by our government. And I talk about how John Wilkes Booth was manipulated into the position that he took in the final chapter of my book. So people can learn more about that. We didn't get into all the details, of course, tonight, but um, there are reasons John Wilkes Booth carried out this assignment.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed it. So, and as I mentioned earlier, easy read, not in the sense that it's easy to digest. It's not super
Mm.
super technical and complicated. Um, People that don't know much about the assassination can just get in. And you did a great job. So definitely recommend it. And thank you again. It was I truly enjoyed it. It was something I had been looking forward to, and it turned out to be everything I was hoping it would be.
Oh, great.
We did go
Yeah,
deep.
we definitely went deep tonight. I think this is actually the longest interview I've done on the Lincoln assassination.
Wow. Yeah. And I feel we could even gone deeper still. But we can definitely do a part two down the line. Alrighty, Mr. Perloff. You have a good evening and thank you again. Can't thank you
Thank you very
again
much,
enough.
Wheezy. Appreciate it. Appreciate the invitation and the chat.
Absolutely. Take care now.
Okay.